Tonight, we are traveling back more than 700 million years to a time when the Earth slipped into a cold so deep it forgot how to let go. The planet did not freeze at the edges first. Ice spread without restraint, flowing outward from the poles until it reached the equator, covering regions that had once known steady warmth and sun. This was not a familiar ice age with seasons that came and went. It was a planetary stillness that endured far longer than anything humans would ever witness. Oceans vanished beneath unbroken ice for millions of years. Weather systems weakened, then faded, until much of the planet became eerily quiet. Without open water or shifting air, seasons lost their meaning. The Earth's surface reflected sunlight back into space, trapping the planet in cold with no easy path out. Scientists call this period Snowball Earth, a state driven not by an external disaster, but by Earth's own climate system turning against itself. Life did not disappear, but survival narrowed to fragile margins. Some evidence suggests the planet came close to becoming uninhabitable. Other evidence hints at quiet persistence, hidden far beneath ice or deep within the oceans, waiting without movement or urgency. But how close did Earth come to locking itself in ice forever? And how did life endure when the surface offered almost nothing at all? Tonight, we ease into the longest winter our planet has ever known. But before we begin, if you find comfort in these quiet journeys through science and story, it would mean the world to me if you gave this video a gentle like and maybe tap subscribe. It helps more curious minds like you find their way to this peaceful little corner of the internet. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight and what time is it there? I love seeing how far across the world these soft explorations travel. So now take a deep breath, let your shoulders loosen, and together let us drift softly into the age when the earth forgot how to be warm. When we speak softly of ice ages, we are usually describing a rhythm Earth knows well, a slow tightening and loosening that plays out over tens of thousands of years. Ice advances from the poles as sunlight shifts and seasons tilt, then gradually retreats when balance returns. Snow accumulates, glaciers grow heavy and wide, but they remain part of a breathing system. Oceans continue to circulate. Winds still carry moisture. Sunlight, though weakened, continues to touch dark land and open water, warming surfaces enough to prevent cold from consuming everything at once. In these familiar ice ages, the planet never truly forgets how to thaw. Even at their peak, they contain within them the seeds of their own ending, small imbalances that nudge Earth gently back toward warmth. Ice reflects sunlight, but land and sea absorb it. Carbon continues to move between rock, water, air, and life. Volcanic heat whispers upward from below. Time works patiently, always leaning toward recovery. What makes these glacial periods self-limiting is not any single force, but the quiet cooperation between many systems that never fully shut down. As ice spreads, rainfall often decreases, slowing the natural processes that remove carbon dioxide from the air. This allows greenhouse gases to accumulate slowly, trapping more heat over long spans of time. Darker ocean surfaces absorb sunlight and release warmth back into the atmosphere. Even when forests retreat and ecosystems thin, the planet remains active, restless, capable of adjustment. Cold advances, but it does so with restraints, held in check by feedbacks that resist total surrender. The result is a world transformed, but never silenced, a winter that knows it must one day pass. Snowball Earth did not follow this pattern. Somewhere along its slow descent into cold, the familiar safeguards failed, not abruptly, but one by one, as if the planet quietly crossed a threshold it could not see. Ice spread far enough to begin reflecting almost all incoming sunlight, The darker surfaces that once absorbed warmth vanished beneath white, blinding sheets. With less heat entering the system, temperatures dropped further, allowing ice to spread faster still. The balance tipped, not dramatically, but decisively. Earth was no longer negotiating with winter, it was reinforcing it. Oceans sealed beneath ice lost their ability to exchange heat and gases with the air above. Rainfall dwindled, winds weakened, the mechanisms that usually softened glacial extremes fell into disuse, not destroyed, but suspended, waiting for conditions that would not return for millions of years. In this state, winter ceased to be a season and became a condition. It was no longer something that arrived and departed, but something that settled and remained. Sunlight still reached the planet, but it mattered less now, glancing off ice and returning to space unchanged. Warmth from below continued to rise from Earth's interior, but it was muted by kilometers of frozen crust above it. Even time itself seemed altered, stretched thin across an unchanging surface. This was not cold, measured by temperature alone, but cold defined by immobility. A planet locked into stillness, its systems running at their faintest settings, conserving energy rather than circulating it. When the entire planet enters winter, the meaning of survival changes. There are no refuges created by latitude or season, no summers waiting just beyond the horizon. Everything familiar about climate becomes compressed into a single, global experience. Water does not travel freely, air no longer moves with purpose, landscapes lose their contrasts. What remains is endurance, measured not in growth or abundance, but in patience. Earth itself became patient during this time, holding its breath, allowing processes to slow to nearly nothing, while deeper forces continued their unseen work. This was a world where change happened not on the scale of generations, but on spans so long they blurred into quiet persistence. Snowball Earth stands apart because it reveals something subtle and unsettling about planetary balance. Stability does not always fail loudly. Sometimes it drifts, step by step, into a state that feels calm from a distance, yet is extraordinarily difficult to escape. This was not a harsher version of a known cycle, but a fundamentally different mode of existence, one where winter was no longer part of a rhythm, but the rhythm itself. And in that frozen stillness, Earth waited, not broken, not dead, but altered, carrying the memory of warmth deep beneath the ice, patiently enduring until the conditions for change could finally return. Long after the planet had settled into its frozen stillness, long after familiar patterns had faded into patience, the most unsettling clues were left behind, not in the ice itself, but in stone warmed by ancient suns, in places that once lay near the equator, where light had fallen steadily and heat should have ruled without interruption. Rocks formed under unmistakable signs of crushing cold. These stones carried the quiet handwriting of glaciers, fine scratches etched into their surfaces, as if something heavy had passed slowly over them. Rounded fragments lay embedded within finer layers, dropped gently from melting ice into sediments that should never have known frost. The textures told a careful story, one of pressure and motion, of ice moving with purpose across ground that once belonged to the tropics. These rocks did not whisper of brief cold snaps or distant influence. They spoke of ice that arrived fully formed, powerful enough to shape landscapes in regions where palm-like forests might once have grown and shallow seas had calmly absorbed sunlight. Time locked these messages into the Earth's crust, waiting hundreds of millions of years for human eyes to notice that something profoundly unexpected had happened. Under everything scientists once understood about climate, ice at the equator should have been nearly impossible. Sunlight strikes these regions most directly, delivering heat that overwhelms seasonal variation. Even during strong glacial periods, the tropics are meant to remain open, acting as Earth's thermal anchor, the place that keeps the planet from tipping too far into cold. Warm oceans circulate heat toward the poles. Evaporation feeds clouds, clouds feed rain, rain feeds chemical cycles that quietly shape the atmosphere. The equator is where winter traditionally loses its strength. For ice to exist there, and not just briefly, but long enough to grind rock and leave lasting scars, something extraordinary had to override every stabilizing force at once. Heat had to become irrelevant. Sunlight had to lose its authority. The planet had to enter a state where geography no longer mattered, where latitude could no longer protect warmth from cold. Ice at the equator was not simply another data point. It was a statement that Earth had crossed into unfamiliar territory, a climate state that no modern world experiences, and no simple model predicted. When these tropical glacial rocks were first recognized, they unsettled more than a few long held assumptions. Climate science had been built on balance, on gradients between hot and cold, wet and dry, light and dark. The idea that ice sheets once stretched uninterrupted across the planet broke those gradients apart. It suggested a world that functioned under a different logic, where feedbacks did not soften extremes but amplified them. Researchers debated whether the rocks could have traveled far from their origins, carried by tectonic plates, or deposited by rare events, but the evidence remained stubborn. Paleomagnetic signals preserved within the minerals showed that these stones formed close to the ancient equator itself. Their story did not drift across latitudes, it emerged precisely where it should not have existed. Slowly, the impossible became unavoidable. This realization forced a quiet but profound shift in how scientists understood planetary behavior. Earth was no longer just a system that oscillated gently around comfort. It was capable of locking itself into conditions far outside what life seemed designed to endure. The tropics, once seen as the planet's unwavering refuge, could be stripped of their protection. Ice did not merely advance, it reorganized the rules. Climate, it seemed, could collapse into states that resisted recovery, states that felt stable only because nothing changed anymore. Snowball Earth was no longer a poetic exaggeration, but a literal description supported by scars carved into stone at the center of the ancient world. In this way, those tropical rocks became more than geological curiosities. They became reminders that the Earth's history is not a straight line of gentle adaptation, but a record of thresholds crossed quietly and rarely reversed. The presence of ice where warmth should have reigned told of a planet willing to abandon its own safeguards under the right conditions and to remain that way for spans of time so long they stretched the human imagination. And as these revelations settled into scientific thought, they carried with them a humbling truth that even the most reliable features of a world can, under the slow weight of feedback and imbalance, be rewritten completely, leaving behind only stone to remember how different everything once became. As ice claimed more of the planet's surface, something subtle but decisive happened to the relationship between Earth and its star. Sunlight continued to arrive each day, steady and patient, pouring down from space as it always had. At the equator, it still struck the planet nearly head on, carrying more energy than anywhere else on the globe. In another world, at another time, that light would have soaked into dark oceans and bare ground, sinking downward, spreading warmth through water and stone, and slowly loosening winter's grip. But now, the surface waiting beneath that light had changed. Ice does not welcome heat the way water does. It turns it away. Each sheet of frozen surface became a mirror, pale and unyielding, reflecting much of the incoming energy back toward the sky before it could do any work. The brighter the planet became, the colder it stayed. Day after day, light arrived and departed almost unchanged, slipping past Earth as if it no longer belonged there. The ice did not need to be thick everywhere to enforce this rule. Once enough of the surface turned white, the balance tipped. Sunlight lost its authority, not because it weakened, but because the planet had learned how to refuse it. This reflection changed the meaning of warmth itself. Heat stopped accumulating and began to vanish. The small gains made during brief periods of seasonal variation were erased almost immediately, undone by nights that grew longer and surfaces that never truly thawed. Even areas that might have experienced momentary softening during parts of the year could not hold on to it. Any meltwater that formed quickly refroze, adding polish to the ice and making it even more reflective than before. Each attempt at warming quietly reinforced the cold. The planet entered a loop that fed on its own success, where freezing made further freezing easier, and light became less and less relevant with every passing span of time. This was not a sudden collapse, but a patient one, a system settling deeper into a stable state that happened to be hostile to change. The mechanisms that usually rescue Earth from extended cold were still present, but they could no longer reach the surface where they mattered most. Warmth from the planet's interior continued to rise, but it was diluted and spread thin beneath layers of ice and sealed oceans. Volcanic gases still escaped from deep places, but the pathways that once carried their influence through air and water had narrowed. With oceans capped and evaporation subdued, the familiar circulation between sea, sky, and land slowed to a near standstill. Clouds thinned, rain became rare. The slow chemical dances that depend on flowing water weakened, leaving the atmosphere increasingly isolated from the ground below. Earth was still alive, with activity inside, but it was wrapped in insulation that prevented that energy from expressing itself at the surface. Heat existed, but it could not gather, could not travel, could not tip the balance back toward release. In warmer worlds, small changes often grow into recovery. A patch of dark water opens, absorbs sunlight, and widens. A shift in winds carries heat into a frozen region. Moist air condenses, falls as rain, and reshapes the chemistry of air and rock. During Snowball Earth, these gentle rescues failed one by one. Open water struggled to remain open. Winds lacked the strength to move warmth across continents of ice. Moisture had little chance to rise or fall, trapped beneath frozen lids or locked away in snow that never melted. The planet's usual flexibility hardened into rigidity. Warming mechanisms did not break, they simply found themselves disconnected, their influence unable to pass through the frozen architecture above them. Time stretched within this state, long enough for the ice to feel permanent. From space, Earth would have appeared bright and distant, a pale sphere reflecting the sun like a quiet signal that never answered back. The energy balance favored cold so completely that warmth became something stored deep below, accumulating slowly and invisibly, unable to announce itself. This was how sunlight became insufficient, not through absence, but through exclusion. The planet had arranged itself in such a way that the very force that once nurtured life and moderated climate was turned away at the surface, left to slide past while Earth remained locked in stillness. In this frozen equilibrium, the failure of warming was not dramatic, but complete, a calm persistence of cold that endured simply because nothing could interrupt it anymore. As the frozen surface spread and sunlight slipped away unused, Earth crossed a quiet boundary where cold stopped behaving like a temporary visitor and began acting like a keeper. The process did not require violence or speed. It relied on repetition and reinforcement, the simple act of ice making more ice possible. Each new stretch of frozen ground brightened the planet slightly, and each brightened surface reflected a little more warmth back into space. That loss, barely noticeable at first, accumulated over time. With less heat absorbed during each passing day, temperatures drifted lower. Lower temperatures allowed ice to persist longer and spread farther. The cycle required no new trigger once it began. It fed itself gently, the way a whispered phrase can echo louder each time it rebounds from a closed room. This was the ice and light feedback, simple in motion yet profound in consequence, a loop that quietly replaced balance with momentum. In earlier climates, Earth had ways to resist such runaway change. When cooling began, other processes usually rose to meet it, restoring equilibrium through slow but reliable adjustments. But during Snowball Earth, those counterweights weakened together. Ice reached latitudes where it erased the planet's darker surfaces almost entirely. Land and open water, which once acted as sponges for sunlight, became rare interruptions in a continuous frozen shell. The planet's appearance shifted toward uniform brightness, and with that shift came a loss of contrast. Without contrast, heat could not concentrate. Without concentration, thawing could not hold. Any small patch that briefly softened under the sun was surrounded by ice eager to reclaim it. Meltwater froze quickly, smoothing the surface and making the reflection even more efficient. Cooling no longer needed encouragement. It sustained itself through geometry and color alone. At the same time, Earth's internal rhythms slowed their exchange with the surface. Oceans, sealed beneath ice, could no longer breathe freely with the atmosphere. Evaporation dwindled, rainfall faded. The long pathways that once moved materials between sea, sky, and stone narrowed until they carried only a trickle. Chemical reactions that usually removed warming gases from the air weakened, not because they were destroyed, but because they relied on flowing water and exposed rock that now lay frozen and isolated. The atmosphere became less responsive to the ground beneath it, and the ground beneath it became less capable of answering back. Earth's systems were still present, but they were no longer talking to one another in ways that allowed balance to return quickly. This growing silence between systems marked the moment Earth lost its familiar ability to stabilize. Climate had once functioned like a slow conversation, with shifts answered by countershifts, extremes moderated by patience. During Snowball Earth, that conversation thinned into a monologue spoken by ice alone. Cooling did not provoke resistance, it removed it. Each reinforcing step reduced the number of remaining paths back toward warmth. The planet was not frozen because it wanted to be cold, but because the architecture of its surface now favored cold in every exchange. Stability did not vanish, it transformed. Earth found a new stable state, one defined by persistence rather than change, where remaining frozen was easier than thawing. Within this locked condition, time became the dominant force. Processes that once mattered over thousands of years now required millions. The feedback holding Earth in ice was not fragile. It could absorb small disturbances without breaking. A slight increase in heat one year meant little against the reflective expanse that had accumulated. A brief pulse of warming faded before it could reorganize the surface. The cold was not aggressive, it was patient. It waited out fluctuations, confident that the underlying balance favored its return. This patience is what made the state so enduring. Earth did not oscillate around comfort. It rested in cold, settled there as if into a long sleep. Yet even in this deep freeze, the planet was not inert. Beneath the ice, the interior continued its slow, relentless work. Heat rose from within, gases escaped from the crust. Movements too gradual to notice over human spans continued uninterrupted. None of this immediately challenged the frozen surface, but it ensured that the system was not truly at rest. Earth had lost its ability to stabilize quickly, but not its capacity for eventual change. For now, though, the balance belonged to ice, reinforced by light turned away, by slowed cycles, and by a feedback that required nothing more than time to maintain itself. In this way, the planet locked itself into cold, not through collapse, but through quiet agreement among its own processes, settling into a state that could endure far longer than any ordinary winter ever could. As the frozen surface continued its patient expansion, the oceans felt the change long before they disappeared from view. Sea ice crept outward from the margins, forming first as seasonal skins, then as thicker, more permanent lids that resisted melting. What had once been restless water, shaped by winds and tides, began to stiffen and slow beneath this growing cover. The boundary between air and sea, once alive with motion and exchange, narrowed into a fragile interface where contact became rare. Waves no longer broke freely. Spray no longer rose to carry salts and heat upward. The ocean's surface, once an open conversation with the sky, was gradually sealed, transforming a dynamic skin into a barrier that altered everything below it. This closing did not happen everywhere at once, but over time, the pattern repeated itself across basins and latitudes until open water became an exception rather than the rule. With ice in place, the easy breathing between ocean and atmosphere began to falter. Normally, gases move quietly across the sea surface, oxygen dissolving into water, carbon dioxide slipping back into the air, a steady exchange that supports life and balances chemistry. Under ice, this movement slowed dramatically. The thickening cover acted like a lid pressed gently but firmly downward, reducing the area where air and water could meet. Even where cracks formed, they were narrow and fleeting, opening and closing with stress and temperature, never lingering long enough to restore full circulation. The ocean still held vast stores of dissolved gases, but replenishment became uncertain. Layers of water grew more isolated from one another, stratified by temperature and salinity, with fewer currents to stir them back together. What once circulated freely now lingered in place, carrying the same chemistry year after year. This quieting had consequences that rippled outward through marine life. Many organisms depend on movement, on currents that deliver nutrients and remove waste, on mixing that brings fresh oxygen into deeper layers. As circulation weakened, these pathways narrowed. Productivity at the surface declined as light struggled to penetrate ice and as nutrients failed to rise from below. The thin ribbon of life that usually thrives near sunlit waters faded into something smaller and more restrained. Below the ice, ecosystems did not vanish, but they slowed, metabolism adjusted. Growth rates declined. Survival favored endurance over expansion, conservation over abundance. The ocean did not become empty, but it became subdued, like a library after closing, holding knowledge and life in quiet suspension. Sound itself would have changed in this sealed world. The familiar voices of waves, storms, and rain softened or disappeared entirely, replaced by the occasional creak of shifting ice or the deep, distant movements of water pressing against frozen boundaries. The oceans became quieter not just biologically, but physically. With winds weakened and surfaces locked, energy that once traveled across vast distances dissipated locally. Large-scale currents slowed. Heat transport diminished. The ocean's role as a moderator of climate faded, reinforcing the stillness already taking hold across the planet. What remained was a system conserving itself, holding on to what little energy and organization it had, waiting for conditions that would allow movement to return. As this quiet settled in, the oceans became less visibly alive, yet not lifeless. In the darkness beneath ice, small communities persisted, adapted to low energy and long waits. Microbes continued their slow work, transforming chemicals, recycling matter, maintaining fragile loops of survival far removed from sunlight. These forms of life did not announce themselves through blooms or rapid change. They existed through steadiness, through patience measured in spans longer than memory. The ocean's vitality retreated inward, away from surfaces and spectacle, into processes so subtle they left little trace at the time. To an outside observer, the seas might have appeared inert, frozen reservoirs beneath a white shell. In truth, they had become something quieter and more inward looking, alive in ways that did not depend on motion or light. This closing of the oceans marked a profound shift in Earth's story. Water, once the planet's great connector, became a series of isolated chambers. Exchange slowed, variety narrowed. Yet within that narrowing, stability of a different kind emerged. By sealing themselves, the oceans reduced loss, preserving heat and chemistry in deep layers where the ice above could not reach easily. This quiet endurance mirrored the planet's broader state, a world favoring patience over expression. In this way, the oceans did not simply shut down. They adapted to enclosure, becoming less active at the surface while remaining quietly persistent below, carrying life through the longest winter by learning how to survive without the noise and motion they once knew so well. As the oceans grew quieter beneath their frozen coverings, the air above them changed as well, thinning into something calmer and less responsive than before. Evaporation, once driven by the constant exchange between warm water and open sky, slowed almost to nothing. With ice sealing the surface, there was little liquid water left to rise into the air as vapor. The familiar invisible lift, where warmth pulls moisture upward and seeds clouds across the globe, became a rare event rather than a daily rhythm. The atmosphere, deprived of its steady supply of water, dried and settled. Clouds that once traveled vast distances thinned or vanished, leaving long spans of clear, motionless sky. Without moisture to carry energy upward, the air lost much of its ability to move heat around the planet, reinforcing the quiet already spreading across land and sea alike. Rainfall followed evaporation into decline. Where clouds did manage to form, they were often weak and short-lived, releasing little water before dispersing. Rivers that once flowed steadily across continents diminished, then stilled, their channels preserved in ice or dust rather than renewed by fresh rain. Chemical processes that relied on flowing water slowed dramatically, altering how rocks and gases interacted at the surface. Landscapes stopped changing in familiar ways. Valleys were no longer reshaped by running water. Sediments settled where they lay, undisturbed for ages. The sound of rain, once a universal presence, shaping ecosystems and climates, became an uncommon memory. In its absence, the planet's surface entered a state of preservation rather than renewal, holding forms in place rather than reworking them season after season. Winds weakened as well, losing both strength and purpose. Normally, differences in temperature between regions drive air to move, creating circulation that redistributes heat and moisture. During this frozen era, those contrasts softened. With the surface covered in ice and sunlight largely reflected away, temperature gradients flattened. There was less warmth to rise and less cold to sink in dynamic patterns. Air masses lingered longer where they formed, drifting slowly rather than racing across continents and oceans. Storms became rare, their energy starved by the lack of moisture and reduced thermal contrast. The sky grew calmer, not because forces ceased to exist, but because the conditions that energized them were gone. Wind, like water and warmth, found fewer pathways to express itself. In this muted atmosphere, weather as it is commonly understood nearly disappeared. There were no reliable cycles of rain and drought, no advancing fronts or swirling systems marking the passage of time. Seasons blurred into one another, defined less by change than by persistence. Day followed day with little variation, sunlight rising and falling over an unchanging surface. The planet entered a state where the usual signals of motion faded, replaced by long stretches of quiet continuity. Earth became a place where stillness was not an absence, but a dominant feature, shaping everything from climate to chemistry through its steady presence. This stillness extended into life itself. Plants and microbes that once depended on regular moisture adjusted to scarcity and predictability rather than abundance. Growth slowed, and survival favored those capable of waiting. Without wind to spread spores widely or rain to transport nutrients across landscapes, ecosystems became more isolated. Exchange between regions lessened, and local conditions grew more stable but less forgiving. In many places, the environment settled into patterns that would remain unchanged for immense spans of time, allowing life only at its most patient margins. Yet, even in this calm, the planet continued its quiet work. Subtle movements persisted beneath the surface. The atmosphere, though subdued, remained connected to deeper processes, slowly accumulating changes that were not immediately visible. The absence of familiar weather did not mean the absence of motion entirely, but a shift toward motion so gradual they blended into stillness itself. Earth had not stopped breathing. It had slowed its breath to a pace almost imperceptible, conserving energy in a world where movement had become costly. This was a planet defined by stillness not as an ending, but as a condition, one that reshaped every interaction between air, water, land, and life. Weather did not vanish completely, but it lost its role as a daily force of change. In its place arose a calm so profound that time itself seemed to stretch within it, a long pause in which Earth held its form, waiting patiently within a frozen balance that could endure far longer than any storm or season ever could. As the frozen world settled deeper into its long pause, darkness became an unspoken companion to the cold. Ice did not merely skim the surface or form fragile skins that sunlight could penetrate with ease. Over time, it thickened, layer upon layer, pressed by snowfall that never fully melted and compacted by the slow weight of its own persistence. In many regions, this ice grew to extraordinary depths, thick enough to muffle the warmth below and the light above. Estimates formed much later suggest that vast stretches of the planet were covered by ice measuring hundreds of meters, and in places perhaps more, dense and pale, built gradually without interruption. This was not a landscape shaped by seasonal melt and refreeze, but one sculpted by accumulation alone. Each new fall of snow, each thin glaze of frozen water, became part of a structure that light struggled to pass through, turning the surface into a lid that dimmed the world beneath it. Sunlight still arrived, faithful and unchanged, but its journey ended quickly. Only a small fraction of its energy could pass through such thick ice, and even that weakened light scattered and faded before reaching the ground or the water trapped below. What remained was a muted glow, more suggestion than illumination, a faint presence that lacked the strength to shape days or mark time. Colors lost their sharpness, shadows softened into indistinct gradients. In many places, the surface may have appeared uniformly pale, reflecting brightness outward while allowing little inward. For anything living beneath the ice, the world above would have felt distant and unreachable, its rhythms reduced to barely perceptible shifts. The line between day and night blurred, especially at higher latitudes where darkness already lingered for long stretches. Light became scarce, and where it did exist, it was thin and unreliable, insufficient to sustain familiar forms of surface life. Over immense spans of time, this dimness became normal. Earth adjusted not just to cold, but to low visibility, to a world where the sky's influence was largely aesthetic rather than functional. The familiar relationship between sun and surface, which governed so much of climate and biology, loosened its grip. Photosynthesis near the surface declined sharply. Any organisms that relied on light retreated or adapted, favoring places where ice was thinner or where cracks and pressure ridges allowed brief shafts of illumination to pass through. These moments of brightness were fleeting, never guaranteed, and never widespread. The dominant experience of the surface was one of steady, unchanging dimness, a planet existing in its own muted twilight. From afar, Earth during this time would have looked strikingly simple. The complex patterns of ocean and land, cloud and current, were hidden beneath a continuous shell of ice. The planet may have appeared almost featureless, a smooth, bright sphere suspended in space, its surface lacking the contrast that once revealed continents and seas. Clouds were fewer, winds weaker, storms rare, leaving the ice itself as the main visible texture. Subtle variations in brightness marked differences in thickness or snowfall, but the overall impression was one of quiet uniformity. It was a world stripped of visual complexity, not because it had become empty, but because its complexity was buried. For millions of years, this frozen appearance endured with little outward change. The surface recorded time not through growth or decay, but through preservation. Features remained in place, unaltered by flowing water or shifting air. The ice remembered everything that fell upon it, each layer holding a faint record of the conditions under which it formed. Beneath that ice, Earth's deeper processes continued, unseen and unlit, slowly reshaping the planet in ways that would not become visible until much later. Above, the dim surface held steady, reflecting light back into space and keeping the planet locked in its long winter. This was what darkness meant during Snowball Earth, not total blackness, but an enduring reduction, a soft erasure of detail that lasted longer than any previous climate state. The surface did not flicker between extremes. It remained consistently pale and subdued, a landscape defined by continuity rather than change. In that quiet dimness, Earth waited, its frozen skin holding fast, its interior slowly gathering the conditions needed for transformation, while the surface remained almost unchanged, suspended in a long, cold twilight that stretched across ages beyond ordinary imagining. As researchers began piecing together the quiet evidence left by this frozen world, a careful disagreement emerged, not loud or combative, but persistent, like two interpretations of the same distant memory. The rocks, the chemistry, and the scars left by ancient ice all agreed that Earth had entered an extreme state, yet they did not speak clearly enough to settle how complete that freeze truly was. One vision imagined a planet locked entirely in ice, from pole to equator, oceans sealed beneath thick frozen lids with almost no open water anywhere on the surface. In this view, the Earth became something close to a white sphere, reflective and nearly uniform, its surface almost entirely disconnected from air and light. Another vision allowed for small interruptions in that uniformity, narrow belts or patches where ice thinned or broke, where dark water briefly met the sky and sunlight still touched the sea. Both interpretations arise from the same fragments of stone and chemistry, and both attempt to honor the same silence left behind by deep time. The idea of a fully frozen planet suggests a world pushed to the furthest edge of stability. In this interpretation, ice reached everywhere, and stayed, reinforced by reflection and isolation, so complete that the surface system nearly shut down. Oceans beneath the ice became sealed environments, exchanging little with the air above and relying on slow internal processes to sustain what life remained. Light barely penetrated, weather faded almost entirely. The surface became a long-lasting boundary rather than a place of interaction. This version of Snowball Earth emphasizes endurance over variation, a climate state so stable in its cold that escape required extraordinary accumulation of change over immense spans of time. It explains the strength of the glacial signatures and the dramatic shifts in chemistry recorded in ancient rocks, suggesting a planet that had embraced stillness almost everywhere at once. The alternative picture offers something slightly less absolute, yet still deeply unfamiliar. In this interpretation, ice dominated the globe but did not fully extinguish open water. Near the equator, where sunlight remained strongest, thin regions of ice or persistent cracks may have formed, creating small oases of exchange between ocean and atmosphere. These areas would not have been warm or lively in any modern sense. They would have been harsh, cold, and limited, yet they allowed for minimal circulation of gases and heat. The planet remained overwhelmingly frozen, but not entirely sealed. This vision preserves room for localized activity, small patches where life could access light, and where the carbon cycle retained faint pathways that never fully closed. It suggests a world frozen nearly solid, yet still breathing, however slowly. The reason this question remains unsettled is not a lack of evidence, but the nature of the evidence itself. The rocks that tell this story have been altered by time, shifted by tectonic forces, and rewritten by later chemistry. Signals that once pointed clearly to surface conditions are now filtered through millions of years of transformation. Some clues seem to favor complete ice cover, while others leave space for openings. The planet did not leave behind photographs or continuous records, only scattered impressions, each shaped by local conditions. Science must interpret these impressions carefully, balancing global models with regional observations, knowing that either extreme simplicity or excessive detail can mislead. There is also the quiet realization that the planet may not have chosen one state exclusively. Conditions could have shifted subtly over time, moving between more complete and slightly less complete freezes as internal and external influences ebbed and flowed. The Earth of Snowball times may have been neither perfectly sealed nor comfortably open, but something that drifted along a narrow margin between the two, changing slowly, unevenly, and without dramatic signals. This possibility resists easy classification, making the debate less about choosing sides and more about understanding complexity within apparent stillness. What endures beneath this discussion is a shared recognition of how extreme the situation was, regardless of where the line is drawn. Whether ice covered everything or left rare windows open, the planet entered a state unlike anything familiar today, one that demanded patience from life and humility from those who later studied it. The debate continues not because scientists disagree on the importance of Snowball Earth, but because the planet's memory is incomplete and the silence it left behind invites careful listening rather than simple answers. In that silence, the story remains open, shaped by new discoveries and revised understanding, slowly refining our sense of how far Earth can travel from comfort and still remain quietly alive. As the frozen world endured its long stillness, the conditions that usually allow life to persist thinned to almost nothing. Much of life on Earth depended, directly or indirectly, on sunlight, not merely as illumination, but as the quiet engine that powered growth, repair, and renewal. Sunlight fed photosynthesis, which in turn supported the vast networks of organisms layered above and around it. When light became faint and unreliable at the surface, that foundation weakened everywhere at once. Plants and photosynthetic microbes could no longer gather enough energy to sustain steady growth. With ice blocking light and clouds reduced to ghosts of their former selves, even the brief, diluted brightness that reached the surface struggled to support basic biological function. Over time, energy became scarce, and scarcity reshaped the living world. Life did not simply slow, it lost its primary source of income, forced to survive on reserves that were never meant to last indefinitely. As surface productivity collapsed, the ecosystems built upon it unraveled quietly but completely. Herbivores had little to graze, predators found fewer paths to food. Complex communities that once depended on cycles of growth and decay thinned into simpler arrangements or vanished altogether. Coastal regions, once among the most productive places on the planet, fell silent as ice sealed shorelines and blocked nutrient exchange between land and sea. Open water ecosystems faded as light retreated upward and nutrients failed to circulate. The interconnected web that usually allows life to shift, adapt, and recover fractured into isolated strands. Each collapse weakened the next layer above it, cascading outward through food chains and habitats until the surface of the planet could no longer sustain abundant, visible life. What remained were scattered survivors clinging to marginal conditions, no longer part of thriving systems but fragments enduring alone. This loss of surface life carried consequences beyond biology itself. Living organisms play a quiet but vital role in shaping the atmosphere and oceans, absorbing gases, cycling elements, and maintaining balances that favor stability. As populations dwindled, those contributions diminished. The exchange between life and environment slowed, making recovery even more difficult. Without abundant organisms to buffer change, the planet became more vulnerable to extremes, reinforcing the cold rather than resisting it. Extinction did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It unfolded gradually, as one dependency after another failed, narrowing the space where life could operate. The longer the freeze endured, the more distant recovery appeared, not because life lacked resilience, but because the conditions required for rebuilding remained locked away beneath ice and dimness. From the perspective of deep time, extinction seemed unavoidable because the usual routes of escape were closed. Migration offered little refuge when the entire surface shared the same fate. Adaptation had limits when energy itself was constrained. Evolution requires not just time, but opportunity. And during Snowball Earth, opportunity was rare and shrinking. Each passing millennium reduced the chances that surface ecosystems could reestablish themselves before resources were exhausted. The planet appeared poised on the edge of biological failure, carrying only the smallest traces of life in environments removed from light, warmth, and motion. Survival demanded strategies so slow and restrained that growth itself became a liability. In this frozen equilibrium, Earth seemed to offer no mercy. The conditions that had once nurtured complexity now actively suppressed it. The systems that allowed life to rebound from previous crises no longer functioned at meaningful scales. Everything pointed toward a gradual fading, not a dramatic die-off, but a thinning so extensive that recovery would be impossible once certain thresholds were crossed. From the surface, the world looked empty and inert, its living skin peeled back by cold and time. Under such circumstances, extinction was not a distant threat, but an expectation built into the environment itself, a natural outcome of prolonged darkness, silence, and scarcity. That life persisted at all within this world stands not as a certainty of nature, but as one of the most delicate continuities Earth has ever carried through its long and patient history. Yet, even as the surface world narrowed toward silence, life did not vanish in the way logic might expect. It did something quieter and far more difficult to notice. Instead of fighting the cold, it learned how to wait. In the absence of sunlight, motion, and abundance, the simplest forms of life proved to be the most enduring. Microbes, already ancient long before this winter began, retreated into modes of existence that required almost nothing. They slowed their chemistry, reduced their growth, and adjusted their internal rhythms to match a world where change came only after immense stretches of time. Where complex organisms depended on cycles of plenty, these small lives depended on continuity alone. They did not need forests, reefs, or flowing rivers. They needed stability, however harsh, and Snowball Earth provided exactly that. Hidden beneath ice, within sediments, and deep in the oceans, microbial communities persisted in places shielded from the worst of the surface conditions. Some lived in thin films of liquid water trapped between ice crystals, where pressure and salt lowered freezing points just enough to maintain a fragile boundary between solid and fluid. Others remained active in deep waters insulated from surface cold, where internal heat from the planet still whispered upward. These environments were not generous. Energy arrived slowly, often chemically rather than from light, and nutrients circulated at a pace measured in centuries rather than seasons. Yet for microbes adapted to patience, this was enough. Life did not expand or diversify here. It endured, conserving itself carefully, carrying forward the biochemical patterns that had taken billions of years to emerge. What distinguished survival during this time was not resistance, but restraint. Life slowed almost to a standstill. Cells divided less frequently. Metabolic reactions unfolded at reduced rates. Repair replaced reproduction as the dominant priority. In a sense, life entered a long period of holding, maintaining its structure without striving to grow. This slowing was not a failure. It was an adaptation refined by deep time, a strategy that allowed biological systems to persist through conditions that would have erased more dynamic forms. Snowball Earth became a test not of strength, but of patience, favoring organisms capable of existing without urgency. This persistence reshaped the meaning of extinction itself. While surface ecosystems collapsed and complex relationships faded, the thread of life remained unbroken beneath the ice. It narrowed, became harder to see, but it did not snap. The planet did not reset to emptiness. It carried forward a quiet biological memory, preserved in cells that continued to function even when almost everything else stood still. This continuity mattered deeply, though its importance would not become clear until much later. By refusing to end, life ensured that recovery, whenever it came, would not have to begin from nothing. Time behaved differently for these survivors. Without cycles of day and night that mattered, without seasons that altered conditions meaningfully, life measured existence through persistence alone. Change became something internal, subtle shifts in chemistry and structure rather than visible transformation. Genetic variation continued, slowly, quietly, shaped by pressures that favored durability over novelty. Evolution did not stop, but it softened, proceeding at a pace that mirrored the frozen world itself. Snowball Earth became less a crisis to escape than a condition to inhabit, a long, still corridor through which life passed with deliberate care. This endurance carries a quiet lesson about the nature of survival on Earth. Life does not always respond to hardship with innovation or expansion. Sometimes it responds by becoming smaller, slower, and harder to detect. In doing so, it preserves possibilities that would otherwise be lost. The microbes of Snowball Earth did not know that warmth would eventually return. They did not anticipate oceans opening or sunlight reaching the surface again. They persisted without expectation, maintaining their existence simply because they could. That restraint, repeated across countless generations, carried life through the longest winter the planet ever knew. When the ice finally loosened its hold far in the future, it would find not a dead world beneath it, but a living one that had learned how to wait. The continuity of life through Snowball Earth stands not as a dramatic triumph, but as a quiet refusal to disappear, a testament to the power of patience in a universe that often demands it. Beneath the frozen shell that wrapped the planet, not all ice was the same, and within those subtle differences lay spaces where survival quietly found room to continue. The ice, though vast and enduring, was never perfectly uniform. In places shaped by currents, geothermal warmth, or the slow flexing of Earth's crust, it thinned, sometimes by only a small margin, yet enough to matter. These thinner regions allowed slightly more light to pass through, dim but persistent, just enough to soften the darkness below. They were not open windows or clearings, but gentle weak points in an otherwise sealed world, places where the boundary between surface and depth became less absolute. Over immense spans of time, these thin zones remained fragile yet reliable, forming a scattered network of marginal refuge across a planet otherwise dominated by cold and stillness. Cracks also formed where ice was under constant strain. Pressure built as sheets expanded, collided, and shifted under their own weight, responding slowly to tides beneath and the subtle motion of continents below. In these stress zones, fractures opened and closed again, sometimes sealing quickly, sometimes lingering long enough to expose narrow channels of water to the air above. Through these temporary openings, gases could slip between ocean and atmosphere, and traces of light could penetrate downward. The cracks were never wide, never welcoming in a familiar sense, but they created moments of connection in a world defined by separation. For organisms adapted to scarcity and patience, these moments were enough. Life did not rely on constant access, only on occasional opportunity, and the ice provided it in brief, unpredictable intervals. Pressure zones near coastlines and over underwater ridges offered another form of refuge. In these areas, ice interacted with uneven terrain and moving water, preventing it from thickening uniformly. Here, the frozen surface might be thinner, fractured, or textured, allowing pockets of liquid water to persist below. These environments supported small but resilient ecosystems, isolated from one another, yet sustained by the slow circulation of nutrients and heat rising from the planet's interior. Chemical energy, released where water met warm rock beneath the ice, replaced sunlight as the guiding force of survival. Life clustered in these places not because they were gentle, but because they were stable in their harshness, offering consistent conditions over immense stretches of time. These hidden refuges mattered because they preserved connection. Even when the surface appeared lifeless and sealed, these thin zones and fractures allowed Earth's systems to remain faintly linked. Gas exchange, though limited, never stopped entirely. Chemical cycles slowed, but they did not freeze. The planet continued to breathe, albeit quietly, through these scattered openings. For life, these connections provided continuity, preventing complete isolation and enabling survival strategies that depended on minimal interaction with the wider environment. The refuges became quiet bridges between frozen surface and active interior, places where the long pause of Snowball Earth was softened just enough to remain livable. Within these sheltered spaces, life maintained a foothold, not through abundance, but through reliability. The conditions changed little from one generation to the next, allowing organisms to fine tune their existence to a narrow range of possibilities. Growth remained limited, but survival was steady. Genetic lineages passed forward without interruption, carrying with them the biochemical knowledge required to endure extreme cold, low light, and scarce resources. These refuges acted as biological libraries, storing life's patterns during a time when the planet's surface could no longer support them openly. Over millions of years, these rare places quietly shaped the future. They ensured that when conditions eventually shifted, life would not need to reappear from nothing. Instead, it would emerge from persistence, already adapted to stress and patience. The importance of these hidden refuges lies not in their size or comfort, but in their role as continuities, threads that stitch together past and future across the frozen expanse of time. Beneath the ice, in thin zones and pressure cracks, invisible from afar, Earth carried forward its living memory, waiting calmly for a world that could once again allow that life to spread. Far below the frozen surface, beyond the reach of pale light and sealed skies, the deep ocean continued to offer something rare during this long winter: continuity. While the upper world slowed into silence, the sea floor remained shaped by forces that never paused. Heat from Earth's interior rose steadily through fractures in the crust, meeting cold seawater and transforming it into plumes rich with dissolved minerals. At these places, known later as hydrothermal vents, the ocean floor glowed not with light but with chemistry. Warm, mineral-laden fluids spilled upward like slow-moving breath, carrying energy released from the planet itself. This energy did not depend on the sun, seasons, or surface warmth. It arrived from below, reliable and patient, powered by Earth's internal heat rather than the distant star above. In a world where sunlight had become faint and scattered, this deep chemical glow offered an alternative foundation for life. Around these vents, living communities gathered and endured. Microbes learned to extract energy from chemical gradients, transforming substances like hydrogen and sulfur into the fuel of survival. This process unfolded quietly, without leaves or light, yet it sustained life just as effectively within its narrow bounds. These organisms formed the base of deep ecosystems, supporting small networks of creatures adapted to darkness, pressure, and stillness. Here, life was insulated from surface collapse, protected not by warmth, but by depth. Ice above could thicken without consequence. Weather could vanish entirely. The chemical energy flowing upward from the seafloor remained steady, allowing biological systems to persist even as the surface world became increasingly hostile. The deep ocean did not escape Snowball Earth, but it absorbed its impact differently, turning isolation into shelter. This separation mattered deeply. As surface ecosystems failed and hidden refuges beneath the ice grew sparse, the deep ocean became a kind of lifeboat, carrying life through conditions that would have erased it elsewhere. The vents provided stable environments over vast stretches of time, changing slowly enough for organisms to adjust without urgency. They did not offer abundance, but they offered continuity. In these dark spaces, life could afford to wait. Genetic lineages continued unbroken, biochemical processes refined under pressure, and survival strategies centered on efficiency rather than speed. The deep ocean preserved not just individual organisms, but entire ways of living that did not require sunlight, demonstrating that life could root itself in the planet rather than its star. This reliance on chemical energy reshaped the importance of deep life during Snowball Earth. It was no longer peripheral or unusual. It became central to survival. While surface life dwindled, these deep systems carried forward the thread of biological complexity, maintaining cycles of energy use and matter transformation, even as the planet above seemed frozen into pause. The ocean floor remained a place of motion, its slow currents distributing heat and minerals across basins, supporting life that could persist with minimal input. The contrast between surface and depth grew stark. Above, stillness and dimness ruled. Below, quiet activity continued, unseen and steady. Over millions of years, this deep persistence shaped the future potential of the biosphere. The organisms that survived here carried with them adaptations to extreme conditions, tolerance for scarcity, and the ability to function independently of sunlight. These traits would later influence how life rebounded when ice finally loosened its hold. The deep ocean did not merely shelter life, it refined it, favoring resilience over expansion, patience over dominance. In this way, Snowball Earth became a filter, narrowing life's pathways but strengthening those that remained viable under the harshest constraints. The deep ocean as a lifeboat reminds us that Earth's habitability is layered. When the surface becomes uninhabitable, the planet's interior connections can still sustain life. Heat, chemistry, and time replace light and weather as the primary guides. During the longest winter in Earth's history, survival depended not on escaping the cold, but on descending beneath it, into regions where the planet's enduring warmth continued to flow. There, in darkness and pressure, life held on quietly, ensuring that when the surface finally softened, Earth would not awaken alone, but with a living memory, already waiting to rise again. Even while the surface lay silent beneath ice and dim light, the Earth beneath continued its slow, restless work, unchanged by the long winter above. Heat generated deep within the planet, the quiet inheritance of its formation and ongoing decay, moved steadily upward through mantle and crust. This internal warmth did not flicker or fade with climate. It pulsed patiently, warming rocks, driving currents of molten material, and shaping the seafloor in ways that went unseen from the frozen sky. Beneath the ice, the planet remained active, its inner layers folding, flowing, and releasing energy according to rhythms far older than any surface condition. Snowball Earth did not halt these processes. It merely covered their expressions with ice. Volcanism continued as part of this hidden activity. Along mid-ocean ridges and at scattered points where tectonic plates met or fractured, magma rose and cooled, releasing gases and building new crust beneath the frozen seas. These eruptions were not dramatic cataclysms that broke through the ice above. They were steady, distributed events, reshaping the ocean floor grain by grain. Each eruption delivered heat to the surrounding water and released gases that slowly accumulated within the oceans and atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, among them, escaped continuously from the planet's interior, indifferent to the frozen state of the surface. With oceans sealed and weather muted, this gas did not cycle away as efficiently as it once had. Instead, it lingered, building quietly over immense spans of time. This persistence mattered. Earth's surface systems may have been locked in cold, but the interior was preparing a different future. The gases released by volcanism gathered without immediate effect, their warming potential suppressed by reflective ice and sluggish circulation. Nothing changed quickly. From the surface, the world appeared stable, unaltered, frozen into permanence. Yet below, energy and material continued to accumulate, like warmth beneath a thick blanket. The planet was not dormant, it was storing change. The ongoing movement of plates and the slow creation of new ocean crust also maintained the deep ocean lifelines that had preserved life. Heat from below sustained hydrothermal systems, delivering chemical energy to ecosystems that had become essential during this era. These processes linked Earth's biology and geology in ways that bypassed the frozen surface entirely. Life and planet remained connected through depth rather than exposure, through chemistry rather than climate. The longer the surface winter endured, the more these internal processes defined the planet's trajectory, quietly preparing the conditions that would eventually disrupt the frozen balance. What makes this period remarkable is not that Earth endured cold, but that it did so while remaining dynamically alive. The surface was locked, but the system as a whole was not. Energy continued to flow from within, gases continued to escape, pressure continued to build. The planet was not waiting passively for rescue from outside. It was reshaping itself from within, following rules that operated independently of ice and light. Over millions of years, this internal activity began to matter more than surface reflection. Carbon dioxide accumulated slowly but relentlessly in the atmosphere, its warming influence growing stronger as concentrations rose. The ice above could reflect sunlight, but it could not block the infrared warmth beginning to gather below. This slow divergence between surface stillness and internal motion set the stage for transformation. The same processes that had once seemed irrelevant during the deep freeze became decisive precisely because they never stopped. Earth's climate system, locked in cold by surface feedbacks, was being nudged from another direction entirely. The balance was shifting not through sudden change, but through patient accumulation. Every volcanic pulse, every movement of molten rock, added to a growing imbalance that the ice could not permanently contain. In this sense, Earth's survival during snowball times was never solely about endurance. It was also about continuity of motion, the refusal of the planet's interior to conform to the conditions above it. The frozen surface hid this activity, but it could not cancel it. Over vast stretches of time, the contrast between a living interior and a locked exterior grew sharper until the pressure for change became unavoidable. The planet's warmth, long buried and patient, was preparing to reassert itself, carrying with it the promise that even the longest winter could not last forever when the earth beneath never truly fell asleep. As the frozen world lingered in its quiet balance, one of Earth's most familiar regulating systems began to lose its rhythm. The carbon cycle, which usually moves gently between air, water, rock, and life, depended on motion, contact, and exchange. Rainfall carried carbon dioxide from the air into oceans and onto land, where it reacted with exposed rock and was slowly locked away in minerals. Plants drew it from the atmosphere and returned it through decay. Oceans absorbed and released it through their restless surfaces. During Snowball Earth, these pathways narrowed until many of them nearly closed. Rain became rare. Open water vanished. Vegetation retreated from the surface. The usual exits for carbon dioxide were no longer available, not destroyed, but inaccessible beneath ice and still air. What had once been a circulating loop became a slowly filling reservoir with fewer routes for release than ever before. Meanwhile, deep within the planet, sources of carbon dioxide never stopped. Volcanic systems continued to exhale gases from Earth's interior, delivering carbon upward through the crust and into oceans and atmosphere alike. Under normal conditions, much of this gas would have been drawn down again, balanced by weathering, rainfall, and biological activity. In this frozen state, however, those balancing forces had weakened dramatically. Carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere steadily, but left it only with great difficulty. Each volcanic breath added a small amount, almost unnoticeable on its own, yet significant when accumulated over hundreds of thousands, then millions of years. The ice above did not react. The surface remained bright and cold. Nothing visible changed. But the composition of the air was slowly shifting, enriched with warmth that could not yet express itself. This accumulation unfolded patiently, without urgency or signal. Carbon dioxide built up in the atmosphere like warmth gathering behind a closed door. It did not melt the ice quickly, nor did it alter the frozen landscape in obvious ways at first. Instead, it thickened the atmosphere, molecule by molecule, increasing the pressure of air resting on the ice-covered surface. This rise in pressure went unnoticed by any observer that might have existed at the time. There were no storms to announce it, no winds to carry it dramatically across continents. The sky remained calm, yet the atmosphere grew heavier, holding more heat than before, even if that heat could not yet overcome the planet's reflective shell. Earth was changing quietly, from the top down and the bottom up at the same time. In the oceans beneath the ice, carbon dioxide dissolved into cold water, altering chemistry in subtle ways. Some of it was stored temporarily, some of it circulated slowly through deep currents, but little of it escaped back into rock through familiar surface reactions. The usual sinks were sealed away. Sediments accumulated carbon-rich materials without transforming them as efficiently as they once had. The planet was no longer balancing carbon, it was collecting it. This collection did not threaten immediate upheaval, which is why it remained unnoticed for so long. The system appeared stable, but it was stability built on delay, not resolution. What makes this stage of Snowball Earth so striking is its invisibility. The most important change was not happening in ice thickness or surface temperature, but in the unseen composition of air. Carbon dioxide, transparent and silent, was rewriting the future while leaving the present undisturbed. Atmospheric pressure rose gradually, subtly altering how heat moved and how energy was retained. The ice continued to reflect sunlight, maintaining the frozen state, yet the balance beneath that reflection was shifting. Earth's climate system was being loaded in one direction, preparing for a change that would arrive not through sudden catastrophe, but through accumulated imbalance. In this way, carbon dioxide became both a prisoner and a promise. It was trapped by the ice and weakened cycles, unable to escape or complete its usual journey, yet its very confinement ensured that it would eventually matter. The longer the world remained frozen, the more carbon dioxide gathered, deepening the contrast between the apparent stillness at the surface and the mounting pressure within the atmosphere. This was change without drama, transformation without spectacle, a slow rewriting of conditions that required only time to become decisive. Snowball Earth endured because the carbon cycle had stalled, but within that stall lay the quiet preparation for release, an unseen shift that would one day tip the balance and allow the planet to move again. By this stage of the long winter, the planet was no longer simply cold, it was caught inside a structure of its own making, where every part of the system quietly reinforced every other. Ice reflected light, preserved ice, and together they held temperatures low enough to keep that mirror intact. Any small increase in warmth that reached the surface was immediately undone, not by force, but by geometry. Bright ice returned energy to space before it could sink in and accumulate. Meltwater, when it briefly appeared, spread thin across frozen ground and refroze quickly, polishing the surface and strengthening reflection even further. Instead of weakening the freeze, warming attempts sharpened it. This looping behavior left no room for gentle change. The climate could not ease its way toward warmth in small steps, because each step was erased as soon as it formed. Melting required a level of heat far beyond what small variations could provide, and until that threshold was crossed, the system remained locked. At the same time, the processes that normally soften extremes had been muted or disconnected. Oceans that once carried heat across the globe were sealed and stratified, unable to deliver warmth to cold regions. Winds that might have redistributed energy weakened as temperature differences flattened. Rainfall, which helps regulate atmospheric chemistry and move carbon out of the air, had largely disappeared. These stabilizing forces usually act quietly in the background, but during Snowball Earth, they could no longer intervene. The planet had lost its fine adjustments, leaving only coarse ones behind. Climate no longer drifted around balance. It rested far from it, held there by feedbacks strong enough to resist change, but too rigid to allow recovery. The winter endured, not because Earth lacked warmth, but because the warmth could not reach where it needed to matter. This rigidity explains why warming could not begin gradually. In familiar climates, small shifts accumulate. Slight increases in temperature lead to more open water, darker surfaces absorb more light, and feedbacks gently amplify change. During Snowball Earth, those pathways were closed. Dark surfaces were rare and quickly reclaimed by ice. Open water could not persist long enough to alter the energy balance. The system demanded an abrupt transition rather than a slow one. Only when internal forces accumulated to an extraordinary degree could they overwhelm the reflective shell and force a rapid change in state. Until then, the planet remained poised in cold, indifferent to small nudges and minor fluctuations. Time passed, but the surface condition did not. In this way, Earth became trapped not by an external constraint, but by the logic of its own feedbacks. The same mechanisms that usually stabilize climate pushed it toward an extreme when conditions crossed a critical boundary. Snowball Earth was not a failure of regulation, but an overexpression of it. The system worked too well in one direction, locking itself into a pattern that resisted reversal. The longer the winter lasted, the more complete this lock became, as surface processes adapted to stillness and interior processes continued to build pressure without immediate effect. Earth behaved like a system waiting for a switch rather than a dial, unable to move incrementally back toward warmth. This entrapment reshaped the meaning of time on the planet. Millions of years passed with little visible change, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered was happening slowly and out of sight. Ice remained, light reflected, wind slept, and life waited. Beneath this quiet persistence, carbon dioxide continued to gather, heat continued to rise from within, and pressure continued to mount. Yet none of this altered the surface until the accumulated force became unavoidable. Snowball Earth lasted so long because the planet's climate had entered a state that could sustain itself indefinitely given small disturbances. Only an extraordinary buildup, acting from below and within the atmosphere, could break the cycle. This prolonged winter stands as a reminder that planetary systems do not always respond proportionally. Sometimes they resist change until it arrives all at once. Earth was not inching toward thaw throughout snowball times. It was holding steady, constrained by feedbacks that favored cold with unwavering consistency. The duration of the freeze was not accidental. It was the natural outcome of a world caught inside its own rules, waiting patiently for the moment when those rules would finally be overcome by forces that had never stopped gathering strength beneath the ice. Over immense spans of frozen time, the unseen work beneath the ice finally approached a quiet limit, a point where accumulation could no longer remain hidden. Carbon dioxide, released patiently by volcanoes and trapped by a stalled carbon cycle, had been gathering in the atmosphere year after year, century after century, million after million. What once would have been balanced away now lingered, thickening the air and subtly altering how heat behaved across the planet. At first, this buildup changed nothing visible. Ice remained bright. Sunlight still slipped away unused, but pressure continued to rise, and with it, the atmosphere's ability to hold warmth grew steadily stronger. The planet was not warming yet, but it was becoming capable of warming, storing the conditions necessary for change in silence. Eventually, that stored potential reached a critical level. The air grew dense enough with heat trapping gases that even reflected sunlight could no longer escape entirely unchanged. A little warmth began to linger. Not enough to melt ice outright, not enough to soften landscapes, but enough to weaken the perfect efficiency of reflection that had held the freeze in place for so long. The balance that favored cold so completely began to falter at its edges. The difference was subtle, invisible to any surface observer, yet decisive in its effect. For the first time in millions of years, the planet's feedbacks no longer canceled warming entirely. They hesitated. This hesitation mattered. Once the atmosphere could retain a fraction more heat than before, small areas of ice became vulnerable in ways they had not been previously. Where ice was thinnest or fractured, warming lingered just long enough to matter. Melt did not spread gently or evenly. Instead, it arrived unevenly, tipping local conditions past thresholds that had been unbreakable until then. Darker surfaces began to appear, briefly at first, then with increasing persistence. These patches absorbed more sunlight than ice ever could, and that absorption amplified the warming already underway. What had once been an unbreakable loop favoring cold reversed its logic. Melting now encouraged further melting. Reflection weakened, absorption strengthened. The system that had resisted gradual change finally accepted rapid transformation. This was not a smooth awakening. The climate did not stroll out of winter. It flipped. Earth's climate system crossed a boundary where its dominant feedbacks changed direction all at once. The same interconnectedness that had locked the planet into cold now accelerated its escape. Ice loss revealed darker oceans and rock. Darker surfaces absorbed more heat. More heat melted more ice. The transition, delayed for so long, unfolded quickly once it began. The planet shifted from a state that resisted warming to one that amplified it, not through violence, but through inevitability. Snowball Earth did not melt because time ran out, but because the system finally reached a condition where melting was the only stable outcome left. This flipping of states reveals something profound about how Earth works. The planet does not always respond linearly. It can hold one condition for immense stretches of time, then change dramatically once certain limits are crossed. The breaking point was not marked by catastrophe from the sky or sudden internal collapse. It emerged from persistence itself, the same steady processes that had maintained life beneath the ice and reshaped chemistry in silence, eventually reshaped climate as well. Earth moved not because it was forced, but because it had quietly prepared itself to move. As the system shifted, the long winter lost its grip with surprising speed. Ice that had seemed eternal now carried its own undoing within it. Reflection weakened. Warmth accumulated. Motion returned to air and water. The frozen equilibrium that had defined an entire era dissolved, replaced by a dynamic instability leaning toward heat rather than cold. What had been a world of stillness began to stir again. This moment, the breaking point, was not dramatic in the way disasters are imagined. It was decisive because it was overdue. Millions of years of restraint gave way to rapid adjustment as the planet rebalanced itself using the same feedbacks that had once held it frozen. Earth did not forget how to be warm. It simply required time to build the conditions necessary to remember. When the balance finally tipped, change arrived with a speed that felt startling only because of how long stillness had ruled before it. Ice that had endured for millions of years began to lose its certainty, not everywhere at once, but across enough of the surface that the old order could not reassert itself. Once darker water and rock were exposed, sunlight no longer slipped harmlessly away. It sank in, warming surfaces that had forgotten how to hold heat. Meltwater formed and, instead of freezing back into place, began to persist, spreading across ice and pooling in low places. The reflective shell weakened rapidly. Each loss of ice made the next loss easier, until melting no longer crept forward but surged. The planet did not ease out of winter. It moved decisively, as if released from a long-held restraint. As the ice retreated, the amount of water it contained reshaped the surface of the world. Vast quantities of meltwater rushed outward, filling basins, overtopping ancient landforms, and reconnecting oceans that had been sealed and quiet. Sea levels rose quickly, not by gentle increments, but in sweeping advances that drowned coastlines and transformed continental interiors. Valleys that had rested unchanged beneath ice were flooded. Sediments were stripped from frozen ground and carried away in powerful flows, reshaping landscapes faster than erosion ever had before. Rivers returned, but they did not trickle. They surged, swollen by meltwater released all at once from a planet-scale reservoir. Earth experienced flooding not as isolated events, but as a global condition, water reclaiming space that had been locked away for ages. The atmosphere responded just as rapidly. As oceans reopened and warming accelerated, evaporation resumed on a massive scale. Moisture returned to the air, feeding clouds that thickened and darkened the sky. Rainfall increased dramatically, falling onto freshly exposed surfaces that had not known liquid water for vast spans of time. Chemical reactions resumed with renewed force as warm rain interacted with bare rock, carrying dissolved minerals into rivers and seas. Winds strengthened as temperature contrasts returned, redistributing heat and moisture across the globe. Weather, absent for so long, returned in force, reshaping the planet through motion rather than preservation. The quiet of Snowball Earth gave way to a world in flux, defined by movement and energy. For life, this sudden transformation was both opportunity and challenge. The conditions that had nearly erased surface ecosystems now reversed faster than biological systems could easily track. Habitats shifted rapidly. Salinity, temperature, and chemistry changed across oceans and coastlines in short spans of geological time. Some refuges vanished as ice melted away, while new environments formed where none had existed before. Life that had learned to survive through patience now faced a world where adaptation required speed. The rules changed abruptly. Stability gave way to volatility, and organisms that endured the longest winter now confronted the shock of a warming planet. This transition did not allow for gradual recovery. The pace of change outstripped the ability of many organisms to adjust smoothly. Extinctions likely accompanied this thaw, not because warmth itself was hostile, but because it arrived too quickly for delicate balances to hold. At the same time, the reopening of oceans and the return of sunlight created vast new spaces for life to expand into. Nutrients washed from land into seas, fueling bursts of productivity, chemical gradients shifted, offering new pathways for metabolism. The world became complex again, layered with variation rather than defined by uniformity. The end of Snowball Earth was not a simple return to the past. The planet that emerged from the ice was different from the one that entered it. Landscapes had been reset, oceans had been mixed and rewritten. Life had been filtered by extreme endurance and then challenged by rapid change. The thaw did not erase the effects of the long winter. It built upon them, using the stored energy and accumulated chemistry to drive a new phase of Earth's history. In this way, the longest winter ended not with a quiet fade, but with a planetary reawakening. Ice retreated, waters surged, skies darkened with clouds, and motion returned everywhere at once. The world shifted states as decisively as it had entered the freeze, moving from stillness to activity in a span far shorter than the silence that preceded it. Snowball Earth released its grip, and in doing so, set the stage for a transformed planet, one reshaped not just by survival, but by the force and speed of its return to warmth. The return of warmth did not settle gently across the planet. After ages of reflection and restraint, the atmosphere now held more heat than it had in any remembered chapter of Earth's past. Carbon dioxide that had accumulated quietly during the long freeze did not vanish when the ice retreated. It lingered, thickening the air and trapping warmth with an efficiency the planet had not experienced before. Temperatures rose beyond balance, pushing the climate into an intense greenhouse state that followed the ice like an echo. The world moved not from cold to comfort, but from cold to excess, its systems swinging wide in the opposite direction after being held still for so long. As oceans reopened and surfaces darkened, evaporation surged. Warm air drew moisture upward from newly exposed seas and flooded lowlands, filling the atmosphere with water vapor that amplified heating further. Clouds grew heavy and widespread, no longer sparse or timid as they had been during the frozen era. Rainfall returned not as a gentle resumption, but as a global release. Precipitation fell in thick, persistent sheets, drenching landscapes that had been dry or frozen for millions of years. Rivers carried volumes of water unfamiliar to the land beneath them, cutting channels deeper and faster than gradual erosion ever could. The sky regained its voice, but it spoke loudly now, reshaping the surface through sheer force and abundance. Frozen ground that had remained intact for ages could not withstand this sudden onslaught. Ice-cemented soils weakened and collapsed as water infiltrated them. Slopes gave way. Sediments loosened and moved en masse, swept toward the oceans in vast pulses. The planet's surface, preserved through stillness during Snowball Earth, was abruptly rewritten by motion. Valleys deepened. Plains reshaped themselves. Coastal margins shifted as erosion and flooding worked together to redraw shorelines. What had been protected by cold became vulnerable to warmth, and change unfolded faster than life could track easily. This violent reshaping carried immense quantities of nutrients into the oceans. Minerals locked in rock during the freeze were released into rivers and seas, fueling bursts of biological productivity. Algal blooms likely followed, exploiting the sudden availability of light, warmth, and dissolved material. Yet this productivity was uneven, chaotic, and short-lived in many places, limited by fluctuating conditions and unstable chemistry. The ocean, like the land, was adjusting to extremes rather than balance, absorbing the consequences of rapid input after prolonged isolation. Life faced a world rich in opportunity and danger at the same time. The contrast between the frozen past and the heated present defined this era. Where Snowball Earth had been marked by patience and conservation, the aftermath was shaped by release and acceleration. Processes that once took thousands of years unfolded in far shorter spans. Chemical reactions accelerated, weather systems intensified, landscapes lost their long held stability. The planet seemed to be shedding its frozen memory through motion, redistributing energy and material with urgency rather than caution. It was a time of reorganization, not refinement, as Earth searched for a new equilibrium after being pushed so far from it. For life, this environment demanded flexibility rather than endurance. Organisms emerging from refuges encountered conditions unlike those that had shaped their survival. Warmth was plentiful, water was abundant, yet stability was scarce. Habitats shifted as erosion and sedimentation altered coastlines and seafloors. Nutrient surges came and went. The pace of change favored opportunistic life capable of rapid response over the slow, patient forms that had persisted through ice. Evolution accelerated under pressure, sorting lineages through dynamic environments that rewarded adaptability. This phase of heat after ice was not an aberration. It was the natural counterweight to an extreme freeze. Earth had swung from one end of its climate range to the other, responding to imbalance with imbalance, then using motion and energy to redistribute what had been trapped. Over time, the excess warmth would fade, carbon cycles would resume, and stability would gradually return. But in this immediate aftermath, the planet was restless, actively reshaping itself through rain and erosion, heat and flow. The landscapes that emerged from this period bore little resemblance to those that entered Snowball Earth. They were younger, more varied, and primed for new ecological possibilities, carrying the imprint of both deep cold and intense warmth within their layered histories. When the ice released its grip and water reclaimed the surface, the oceans did not return to what they had been before. They were rewritten almost at once, transformed by the vast pulse of material and energy delivered during the thaw. Meltwater carried enormous amounts of nutrients that had been locked away in ice and frozen soil, sweeping them into rivers and then into the sea. Minerals ground fine by glaciers dissolved into the water, spreading across continental shelves and into open basins. Elements that had accumulated quietly during the long freeze were suddenly available all at once, creating a richness the oceans had not known for immense spans of time. This surge did not arrive evenly or gently. It poured in along coastlines, through deltas, and across newly submerged land, turning once quiet waters into places of rapid chemical change. In many regions, life responded quickly, drawing energy from the abundance, while in others, the sudden excess pushed conditions beyond what existing organisms could tolerate. Productivity soared in patches, faded in others, and reshaped the structure of marine ecosystems from the surface downward. Alongside this influx of nutrients came chemical shocks that rippled through the seas. As rain fell heavily on exposed rock, it carried dissolved compounds into the ocean, altering acidity, salinity, and oxygen availability. Waters that had been isolated beneath ice mixed rapidly with surface layers, redistributing stored gases and changing the balance of life-sustaining elements. In some places, oxygen levels rose, supporting new forms of metabolism. In others, rapid biological activity consumed oxygen faster than it could be replenished, creating zones of stress where only the most adaptable organisms could persist. The chemistry of the ocean became dynamic and unpredictable, shifting in response to inputs that arrived faster than slow cycles could smooth them out. These changes were not subtle. They were felt across entire basins, leaving distinct chemical signatures that would later be preserved in sediments and stone. The oceans became laboratories of rapid transformation, testing life under conditions that combined abundance with instability. As these processes unfolded, entirely new marine conditions emerged. Warmth returned, but it did not bring uniform calm. Currents strengthened as temperature differences reappeared between regions, stirring waters that had remained layered and still for millions of years. Nutrients mixed with depth, feeding surface productivity while also supporting deep ecosystems already adapted to chemical energy. Food webs reorganized, no longer constrained by the narrow refuges that had sustained life beneath ice. Planktonic life expanded into open waters, forming the base of renewed marine systems that spread across the globe. Yet this expansion unfolded within a sea that had been fundamentally altered. Salinity patterns differed from the past. Temperature gradients were sharper. Chemical balances carried the imprint of both deep freeze and sudden thaw. The oceans were familiar in their motion, yet unfamiliar in their composition, bearing the memory of the winter they had survived. For marine life, this rewritten ocean offered both opportunity and challenge. Survivors emerging from refuges encountered spaces filled with energy, nutrients, and warmth, but also marked by rapid change. Adaptation favored flexibility, the ability to tolerate swings in chemistry and temperature, and the capacity to exploit brief windows of abundance. Lineages that could respond quickly spread, while others retreated or vanished. The ocean became a place of experimentation, where new ecological arrangements took shape under conditions unlike any before. The long pause of Snowball Earth had simplified life's pathways. The thaw multiplied them again, but without the gentle pacing that often accompanies recovery. Over time, the oceans began to settle into new patterns. Excess nutrients were gradually cycled. Chemical extremes softened as circulation redistributed energy and matter more evenly. Yet, the imprint of this upheaval remained. Marine sediments recorded layers rich in minerals and organic material, silent witnesses to an era when the seas were abruptly remade. The oceans that emerged from this period were not merely restored, they were transformed, carrying forward the effects of extreme cold, rapid warming, and intense exchange. In being rewritten, they set the stage for future chapters of life, chapters shaped by resilience born in darkness and expansion fueled by sudden abundance, all flowing from a winter that once seemed endless, but ultimately reshaped the planet down to its deepest waters. Long after the ice withdrew and the world reshaped itself, the most faithful witnesses to that distant winter remained exactly where they had always been, embedded quietly within stone. Landscapes that now sit beneath warm skies and drifting clouds still carry physical memories of cold so profound it once reached the heart of the tropics. In layers of ancient rock, scientists later found deposits that could only have formed beneath moving ice, mixtures of fine sediments and large, rounded stones resting together in ways no flowing river or gentle sea could explain. These rocks told of glaciers powerful enough to grind mountains and carry debris across vast distances, then release it suddenly into water as the ice melted. What made these findings extraordinary was not the presence of glacial material itself, but its location. These deposits appeared in regions that geological clues placed near the equator at the time they formed, areas that should have known consistent warmth. Stone recorded what memory could not, that ice once ruled places where sunlight fell most directly. Alongside these physical traces, rocks also preserved subtler signals, written not in shape but in chemistry. Within certain layers, the ratios of carbon and oxygen isotopes shifted in distinctive ways, reflecting profound changes in how the planet processed carbon and heat during and after the long freeze. These isotopic patterns formed when biological activity slowed, when oceans became isolated, and when the atmosphere accumulated gases without its usual release valves. As conditions shifted rapidly during the thaw, these chemical signatures changed just as abruptly, leaving sharp transitions captured in stone. Unlike surface features that erosion can erase, isotopic records are woven into the minerals themselves, locked at the moment of formation. They do not fade or drift. They remain fixed, waiting for careful study to reveal what kind of world produced them. Together, these lines of evidence formed a coherent picture across continents and oceans. Glacial deposits appeared at similar depths in rock sequences on distant land masses, suggesting that the cold was global rather than local. Isotopic shifts aligned in timing, pointing to coordinated planetary changes rather than isolated events. The consistency of these signals mattered deeply. Earth's surface is restless, always reshaped by tectonics, weather, and time. Yet these records survived despite that motion. Mountains rose and fell above them. Seas advanced and retreated. Still, the stones held their story intact, compressing millions of years of climate history into readable layers for those who learned how to listen. Rocks preserve this story so effectively because they form slowly and honestly. They do not reinterpret the past or soften its extremes. Sediments settle layer by layer, each one shaped by the conditions of its time. Once buried and hardened, they become remarkably resistant to change. Even when altered by heat and pressure, they retain echoes of their original chemistry and structure. In this way, stone becomes a long-term memory for the planet, far more reliable than landscapes or life, both of which adapt, migrate, and transform continuously. During Snowball Earth, when surface life retreated and weather stilled, rocks continued their quiet accumulation, faithfully recording conditions that nothing alive could have observed directly. What makes this geological record especially powerful is its patience. These stones did not announce themselves immediately. For hundreds of millions of years, they lay unnoticed, folded into mountain belts or hidden beneath later sediments. Only when careful methods developed could their messages be understood. Paleomagnetic measurements revealed ancient latitudes. Chemical analyses decoded atmospheric changes. Grain textures exposed the movement of long-vanished ice. Each technique added clarity, turning scattered clues into a connected narrative. The story of Snowball Earth did not emerge from a single discovery, but from convergence, many silent witnesses agreeing across time and space. Through these preserved traces, Earth's most extreme winter becomes more than a theoretical possibility. It becomes a documented chapter etched into the planet's bones. The stones do not exaggerate or dramatize. They simply remain, carrying forward a record of ice in sunlight, of oceans sealed and reopened, of balance lost and found again. In their stillness, they remind us that even when a world seems utterly changed, it leaves behind a precise account of how it passed through darkness and returned to motion, written patiently, layer by layer, waiting to be read. As the stones continued to tell their quiet story, another realization slowly emerged. This was not a single accident written once and forgotten. The planet had entered this frozen state more than once, separated by vast spans of time yet shaped by similar forces. One of these deep freezes unfolded earlier, during a period now known as the Sturtian Snowball Earth. Long before the ice described earlier had locked the planet into stillness, another global winter had already done something similar, spreading cold across continents that would later drift far apart. Glacial deposits from this earlier episode appear in rock layers around the world, aligned in ways that suggest ice again reached into low latitudes and lingered there for immense stretches of time. The Sturtian freeze was not brief. It endured for tens of millions of years, long enough for landscapes to adjust, oceans to quiet, and life to retreat into its most patient forms. When it finally ended, the planet reshaped itself, only to return, much later, to familiar warmth and motion. After that thaw, Earth did not learn a permanent lesson. Hundreds of millions of years later, the world entered another global freeze, now known as the Marinoan Snowball Earth. This second episode followed a path strikingly similar to the first, though the continents had shifted and life had subtly changed in the time between. Again, ice spread far beyond the poles. Again, chemical signals in rock recorded a breakdown of familiar cycles and a dramatic reorganization of climate. Again, the thaw arrived abruptly after a long accumulation of internal change. The repetition is not exact in every detail, but it is unmistakable in character. Earth fell into deep freeze, recovered, and then, after long stability, fell again. The rocks record both events with clarity, layering evidence in a way that makes coincidence unlikely. This was not a single rare failure, but a pattern the planet was capable of repeating under the right conditions. The fact that Earth froze repeatedly reveals something fundamental about how its climate system behaves over deep time. The planet does not exist in a narrow comfort zone by default. It balances within ranges shaped by sunlight, atmospheric composition, continental arrangement, and geological activity. During these distant eras, several of those factors aligned in ways that made extreme cold possible more than once. Continents clustered in positions that enhanced reflection and reduced heat transport. Weathering processes drew carbon dioxide from the air efficiently during warm periods, gradually lowering greenhouse levels. Volcanic outgassing continued, but the balance between addition and removal of heat-trapping gases tipped toward cooling. Once ice began to spread far enough, the familiar feedbacks took over, pushing the planet toward full glaciation. In this sense, Earth did not freeze because it was unstable, but because it was too consistent in following its own rules. Each Snowball Earth episode demonstrates how small, steady processes can accumulate until they cross thresholds that lead to dramatic outcomes. Cooling did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded gradually, almost invisibly, until ice gained enough reach to rewrite the surface energy balance. Once that happened, the system accelerated toward cold with little resistance. Recovery followed a similar logic in reverse, driven by processes that never stopped operating beneath the surface. That these conditions arose more than once suggests that Snowball Earth is not an anomaly at the far edge of possibility, but a state embedded within the range of outcomes Earth can reach when circumstances align. What changes between these frozen chapters is not the basic mechanism, but the context. Life diversified between freezes. Continental positions shifted. The chemistry of oceans evolved. Yet the planet repeatedly found itself capable of entering, sustaining, and escaping a global winter. This repetition gives Snowball Earth a different weight in Earth's story. It is not a singular catastrophe, but a recurring test, one that reshaped life and environment each time it occurred. The endurance of life, through both the Sturtian and Marinoan freezes, speaks to resilience refined through repetition, survival practiced more than once under nearly impossible conditions. In recognizing that Earth froze more than once, the longest winter becomes part of a larger rhythm rather than a solitary moment. The planet experimented with its extremes, crossing boundaries, retreating, and doing so again much later under slightly different skies. These repeated freezes remind us that Earth's history is not a straight progression toward stability, but a sequence of long experiments in balance, patience, and recovery, each written quietly into stone and carried forward into the world we inherit today. As the echoes of repeated freezes settled into stone, another truth became clear. Earth did not remain trapped in those extremes, not because it avoided them, but because deeper forces continued to work patiently beneath every surface state. One of the most important of these forces was plate tectonics, the slow movement of the planet's outer shell, sliding continents across the globe and constantly reshaping the arrangement of land and sea. Even during the deepest freezes, the plates did not stop. Continents drifted millimeter by millimeter, opening and closing ocean basins, raising mountain chains, and exposing fresh rock to the atmosphere once ice loosened its grip. Over long spans of time, these movements altered how sunlight interacted with the planet and how heat and moisture circulated. Land masses that once reflected light or blocked currents eventually shifted into configurations that favored warmth and exchange again. Tectonics acted not as a rescue mechanism, but as a slow reconfiguration engine, ensuring that no climate arrangement remained fixed forever. Alongside this motion, Earth's long-term carbon cycling quietly reasserted itself after each freeze. While short-term pathways broke down during Snowball Earth, the deeper carbon cycle never vanished. Volcanic activity continued to release carbon dioxide from the interior, steadily adding warming potential to the atmosphere. Over immense spans of time, this outgassing tipped the balance back toward heat, overwhelming reflective ice and restarting surface processes. Once melting began and liquid water returned, rainfall resumed its role, drawing carbon from the air and depositing it into oceans and sediments. This cycling did not simply switch back on. It rebuilt itself gradually, restoring the planet's ability to regulate temperature across long timescales. Carbon cycling acts like a memory in the climate system, smoothing extremes not immediately, but reliably, preventing permanent lock-in to either frozen or overheated states. What makes this system effective is its imbalance tolerance. When Earth grows too cold, carbon dioxide accumulates because weathering slows. When Earth grows too warm, weathering accelerates, drawing carbon back out of the air. These processes unfold far more slowly than daily weather or seasonal change, but they are persistent. They do not care about surface conditions in the moment. They respond to long trends, adjusting the planet's composition over millions of years until extremes soften. Snowball Earth represented a case where these stabilizers were delayed, not broken. Given enough time, they returned influence and pushed the system away from permanent freeze. These mechanisms together form what can be thought of as planetary stabilizers, not safeguards against change, but guarantees against stagnation. Earth is allowed to wander into extremes, to explore edges of habitability, but it is rarely permitted to stay there indefinitely. Internal heat continues. Plates continue to move. Gases continue to escape the mantle. The planet's interior provides continuity even when the surface appears locked. These stabilizers do not prevent catastrophe or hardship for life, but they maintain a baseline capacity for recovery. Without them, Snowball Earth might have been final. With them, it became temporary, however long it lasted. The fact that Earth escaped multiple global freezes underscores how deeply rooted these stabilizing forces are. Each Snowball Earth ended not through luck or external intervention, but through the same slow processes acting over and over again. Life endured because the planet itself never stopped evolving beneath the ice. The surface froze, the oceans sealed, and the sky stilled, yet beneath all of it, Earth continued to change its own conditions patiently, preparing a path back toward motion and warmth. This interplay between surface extremes and interior continuity gives Earth its unusual resilience. Many worlds may freeze or overheat and remain that way. Earth, by contrast, carries mechanisms that eventually tilt it back toward balance. Not quickly, not gently, but reliably. Snowball Earth shows how far the planet can drift from comfort and still return, guided not by intention, but by physics, chemistry, and time working together across deep history. In this way, Earth did not stay frozen forever because it is not a static world. It is a system built for motion at every scale, from drifting plates to cycling carbon to the quiet rise of heat from within. Even in its longest winters, the planet carries forward the seeds of change, ensuring that stillness is never absolute and that balance, however delayed, always has a way to return. When the planet finally steadied after its wild swings, life began to reoccupy a world that felt both familiar and entirely new. The ice had retreated, the oceans moved again, and warmth returned not as a gentle memory, but as an active presence shaping air, water, and land. From the quiet refuges that had preserved life through darkness and cold, organisms began to spread outward. This rebound was not immediate or uniform. It unfolded unevenly, guided by opportunity rather than design. In newly opened seas, simple life forms multiplied, taking advantage of nutrients released by erosion and mixing. On shallow shelves and in coastal waters, biological activity intensified, rebuilding food webs from the bottom up. The world did not fill with life overnight, but it no longer felt empty or constrained. Life had room again, and it moved into that space carefully, testing conditions that were still shifting beneath it. As ecosystems reassembled, complexity began to grow in ways that had not been possible before the long freeze. During Snowball Earth, survival favored simplicity, patience, and efficiency. After the thaw, those same survivors encountered environments rich in energy and variation. Interactions multiplied, competition returned, new ecological roles emerged as organisms adapted to warmer, more dynamic conditions. Cells specialized, cooperation between organisms became more advantageous. Over time, life explored new organizational strategies, layering complexity onto foundations hardened by endurance. This was not a sudden explosion of advanced forms, but a gradual expansion of possibility, as stable warmth allowed more intricate relationships to persist. The biosphere grew not just larger, but deeper, with more connections and dependencies than before. Stress played a central role in shaping this recovery. The long winter had not merely reduced life, it had filtered it. Only organisms capable of enduring extreme limitations survived to rebuild the world. That endurance carried consequences. Genomes shaped by scarcity responded strongly to abundance. Traits that allowed survival under cold, darkness, and chemical constraint became the raw material for adaptation in a warmer, brighter world. Stress had pruned life back to its most resilient cores, and from those cores, diversity grew again. Evolution did not start fresh after Snowball Earth. It continued from a narrowed base, accelerating as conditions improved and ecological space expanded. The changing environment continued to apply pressure even as conditions softened. Oceans remained chemically dynamic for long periods, and climate fluctuations persisted as Earth settled into new balances. These challenges rewarded flexibility and innovation, pushing life to experiment with form and function. Metabolic pathways diversified, structural complexity increased, Interactions between organisms grew richer and more nuanced. What emerged was not simply a return to pre freeze life, but a biosphere shaped by the memory of hardship. The long winter left an imprint, favoring life that could cope with change rather than relying on stability alone. Over millions of years, this rebound reshaped the trajectory of life on Earth. Increased oxygen availability in parts of the ocean, renewed nutrient cycles, and expanded habitats supported larger and more complex organisms. The groundwork was laid for future evolutionary milestones, not because Snowball Earth directly created them, but because it altered the conditions under which life evolved. Stress acted as a driver, compressing evolutionary possibilities into a narrower channel, then releasing them into a wider world. This combination of constraint and release proved powerful, generating complexity not through comfort, but through recovery. Life after the longest winter carries a quiet lesson about resilience. Survival alone is not the end of the story. What matters is what survival allows next. The organisms that endured Snowball Earth did not merely persist. They transformed the opportunity of recovery into diversification, building complexity on a foundation shaped by patience and restraint. The planet that emerged from ice was alive in a deeper sense than before, its biosphere marked by layers of interaction that reflected both endurance and expansion. In this way, the longest winter did not halt life's progress. It redirected it, forging a path where stress became a catalyst and recovery became a canvas for complexity to unfold. As the planet continued its long recovery, the effects of Snowball Earth extended far beyond the moment when ice finally released its grip. The return of warmth and motion did more than restore familiar conditions. It reshaped the biological stage on which life would evolve for hundreds of millions of years afterward. The oceans, newly mixed and chemically altered, offered environments rich in nutrients and energy, but also marked by variability. These conditions favored organisms capable of coordination, specialization, and cooperation, traits that become increasingly important as life grows more complex. In this recovering world, simple survival was no longer enough. Life that could interact, respond, and organize gained an advantage, setting the groundwork for evolutionary pathways that had previously been difficult or impossible to sustain. One of the most lasting influences of Snowball Earth was the way it restructured ecological opportunity. The long freeze had stripped ecosystems down to their most resilient foundations, removing many established competitors and simplifying food webs. When conditions improved, life expanded into a world with fewer entrenched systems and more open space. This allowed new biological arrangements to take hold. Cells began to form tighter associations. Energy flowed through increasingly layered networks rather than short, simple chains. Over time, this encouraged the development of larger bodies, more specialized functions, and cooperative behaviors that could take advantage of abundant but uneven resources. Recovery did not merely fill empty niches, it created new ones, expanding the range of viable biological strategies. The chemical aftermath of Snowball Earth also played a role in this shift. Increased nutrient delivery to the oceans, combined with renewed circulation, supported sustained productivity. Oxygen availability in certain environments improved, allowing more energy-intensive forms of life to persist. While these changes unfolded gradually, their cumulative effect was profound. Life gained the capacity to support more intricate internal structures and more complex interactions between organisms. This did not immediately produce familiar animals or plants, but it created conditions that made such complexity possible. The biological groundwork laid during recovery would later support major evolutionary developments, including the rise of multicellular life and the elaboration of tissues, movement, and sensory systems. What makes Snowball Earth especially significant is not that it directly caused these later events, but that it reshaped the rules under which evolution operated. Before the freeze, life had already existed for billions of years, yet complexity had progressed slowly. After the freeze, evolutionary experimentation accelerated. Stress had acted as a powerful filter, removing fragile strategies and reinforcing those that could endure uncertainty. Recovery then rewarded adaptability, responsiveness, and cooperation. This sequence of compression, followed by expansion, altered evolutionary momentum. Biology was no longer exploring possibilities at the same pace or within the same constraints as before. The planet itself had changed the evolutionary tempo. This reshaping can be seen as a form of ecological reset, though not one that erased the past. Survivors carried forward adaptations honed by extreme conditions, and those adaptations influenced how life responded to abundance. Flexibility became as valuable as efficiency. Interdependence became more stable than isolation. Over long spans of time, these traits supported the emergence of complex life forms capable of maintaining internal balance while interacting dynamically with their environment. The rise of complexity was not guaranteed by warmth alone. It was enabled by the particular combination of hardship and recovery that Snowball Earth imposed. In this sense, Snowball Earth occupies a quiet but pivotal place in Earth's history. It does not stand as a dramatic origin story or a single turning point. Instead, it acts as a long, shaping pressure that redirected the flow of evolution. By forcing life through a narrow passage and then releasing it into a world transformed by chemistry, climate, and geography, the planet altered what kinds of organisms could thrive and how they could do so. The recovery reshaped biology, not by creating complexity outright, but by making complexity stable and advantageous in ways it had not been before. As life continued to diversify in the ages that followed, it carried with it the imprint of this deep past. The structures, interactions, and dependencies that define complex life today trace part of their lineage to a time when Earth was almost entirely frozen. The rise of complexity was built not only on abundance and stability, but on endurance through extremes. Snowball Earth reminds us that some of the most transformative chapters in life's story begin not in comfort, but in survival, and that recovery can be as creatively powerful as crisis when it reshapes the possibilities of what life can become. Snowball Earth leaves behind a lesson that unfolds quietly rather than dramatically, a lesson about balance and how delicate it can be when stretched across deep time. The planet did not slide smoothly into its frozen state, nor did it drift gently back out again. It crossed thresholds, invisible lines where small changes stopped behaving like small changes and began to reshape everything. Cooling progressed patiently until ice reached regions where reflection overwhelmed absorption, and once that line was crossed, the climate no longer negotiated, it committed. The same was true in reverse. Warming accumulated without visible effect until another threshold was reached, and then change arrived quickly and decisively. These moments reveal that Earth's climate does not always respond proportionally. Instead, it can exist in stable states that resist change, then shift abruptly when limits are exceeded. Snowball Earth stands as one of the clearest examples of this behavior, showing that balance is not a wide plateau but a narrow ridge with steep slopes on either side. What makes this lesson especially relevant is that the feedback systems responsible for these shifts did not vanish with the ancient ice. They remain active today, woven into how the planet responds to sunlight, atmosphere, water, and surface conditions. Ice still reflects light, dark surfaces still absorb it, greenhouse gases still trap heat, oceans still store and redistribute energy. Weathering still removes carbon from the air over long timescales. These processes continue quietly, just as they did hundreds of millions of years ago, even though the conditions are different now. Snowball Earth demonstrates what can happen when feedbacks align strongly in one direction, overpowering stabilizing influences for long periods. It also shows that recovery depends on equally persistent forces working from beneath the surface and across vast spans of time. The planet today feels familiar and forgiving, but the machinery shaping its climate is the same machinery that once locked it into global ice. This perspective reshapes how habitability itself is understood. Life on Earth thrives not because the planet is perfectly stable, but because it usually stays within a narrow range of conditions where feedbacks balance rather than amplify one another. Snowball Earth reminds us that this range is not guaranteed. It must be maintained by ongoing interactions between geology, chemistry, and energy flow. When those interactions drift too far, the planet does not necessarily break, but it can become profoundly hostile to surface life. Habitability, in this sense, is less like a constant and more like an ongoing negotiation. The Earth remains livable because processes that pull it toward extremes are countered over time by processes that pull it back. When those counterweights are delayed or overwhelmed, extreme states become possible. This realization deepens appreciation for the quiet stability of the present world. The absence of global ice or runaway heat does not indicate simplicity, but balance continuously maintained. Snowball Earth reveals how much patience that balance requires, and how easily it can be lost when systems reinforce rather than moderate change. It also reveals resilience, not because extremes are harmless, but because the planet possesses mechanisms that eventually restore motion and diversity. These mechanisms operate slowly, beyond human experience, yet they shape everything life depends on. The lesson is not that Earth is fragile in a shallow sense, but that it is dynamic, capable of moving far from comfort, and just as capable of returning, provided enough time and internal continuity remain. In this way, Snowball Earth becomes more than a story about ancient ice. It becomes a story about limits, persistence, and recovery, about how living worlds occupy narrow corridors between extremes, guided by feedbacks that can protect or endanger depending on how they align. The longest winter teaches that habitability is neither accidental nor permanent. It is sustained through balance that must be continuously earned by the slow, interconnected work of a planet that never truly stops adjusting itself, even when everything at the surface appears frozen in time. As Earth settled into the balance that followed its ancient extremes, the conditions that once allowed a global freeze slowly became less likely, though never entirely impossible. Modern Earth is more stable because its surface and atmosphere are arranged differently than they were during snowball times. Continents are spread more evenly across latitudes, allowing oceans to move heat efficiently from equatorial regions toward the poles. Warm currents circulate continuously, redistributing energy and preventing ice from advancing unchecked. The atmosphere carries higher baseline levels of greenhouse gases than it did before the Great Freezes, creating a background warmth that resists runaway cooling. Life itself now plays a powerful role, maintaining cycles of carbon, oxygen, and nutrients that act as buffers against extreme shifts. Together, these factors form a climate system that absorbs change rather than amplifies it under most conditions, keeping Earth within a narrower and more forgiving range. Yet stability does not mean immunity. The same feedback systems that once drove Snowball Earth still exist, quietly active beneath everyday weather and seasonal rhythms. Ice still reflects sunlight. Reduced greenhouse gases still cool the planet. Weathering still removes carbon from the atmosphere. If several stabilizing elements were weakened at the same time, Earth could drift toward colder states again. A significant reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide over long periods, combined with continental arrangements that favored reflection and blocked heat transport, could begin to tip the balance. A dimmer sun would deepen that effect, though such changes unfold slowly across stellar timescales. Extensive ice growth, once initiated far enough from the poles, could still engage the same feedbacks that once locked the planet into cold. The machinery remains, even if the likelihood of all its parts aligning has diminished. What would need to fail is not a single safeguard, but a network of them. Ocean circulation would have to weaken or reorganize in ways that reduced heat transport. Atmospheric carbon levels would need to fall persistently without being replenished by volcanic activity at sufficient rates. Continental positions would have to encourage ice expansion and reflection rather than heat absorption. Life's regulatory influence would need to be diminished, reducing its ability to stabilize chemical cycles. None of these shifts alone would be enough. Snowball Earth required multiple reinforcing changes that worked together over immense spans of time. Modern Earth benefits from the fact that these systems now counterbalance one another more effectively, but their continued operation is not automatic. They require continuity, motion, and balance. Scientists take the possibility seriously, not because a new Snowball Earth is likely in the near future, but because understanding the past reveals how planetary systems behave at their limits. Snowball Earth demonstrates that climate stability can be deceptive, masking slow drift toward thresholds that only become visible after they are crossed. Studying these ancient freezes sharpens awareness of how feedbacks interact, how long-term processes shape surface conditions, and how recovery depends on deep planetary mechanisms rather than short-term adjustments. The lesson is not alarm, but humility. Earth has left its comfortable range before, not through catastrophe, but through persistence. This awareness extends beyond Earth itself. Snowball Earth informs how scientists think about habitability on other worlds, showing that planets with liquid water and life-friendly conditions can still enter prolonged extremes. It highlights the importance of internal heat, atmospheric composition, and surface arrangement in maintaining balance. Earth's continued habitability rests not on chance alone, but on the ongoing alignment of geological, chemical, and biological processes that operate quietly beneath human notice. In the present world, warmth and cold fluctuate within familiar bounds, giving the impression of permanence. Snowball Earth reminds us that this impression is earned continuously, not guaranteed. The planet remains stable because its systems are actively maintaining that stability, adjusting slowly and persistently across time. Scientists study the possibility of future global freezes, not to predict their arrival, but to understand the conditions that prevent them. In doing so, they listen to the deep history written in stone and chemistry, learning how close Earth once came to a world of total ice, and how the same planet learned, over immense time, to hold itself closer to balance. Beyond Earth, The universe offers countless worlds where ice may dominate not as a passing phase, but as a permanent condition. As astronomers observe distant planets circling faint stars or drifting farther from their suns, they increasingly recognize worlds that resemble Earth during its deepest freezes. Some orbit stars that provide too little warmth to melt widespread ice. Others travel in elongated paths, swinging between extremes that never quite allow stability. Many appear locked beneath reflective shells that send precious energy back into space, preventing warmth from ever gaining a foothold. These snowball like exoplanets are not rare curiosities. They may be common outcomes of planetary formation, worlds that settled early into cold and never found a path back. From a distance, they might appear calm and pristine, frozen spheres quietly circling their stars, yet internally static, locked into climates that resist change. What makes Earth's story stand apart is not that it froze, but that it escaped. Snowball Earth shows that global ice does not guarantee a dead planet, but escape from such a state is neither simple nor assured. Earth possessed a rare combination of traits that allowed it to endure long enough for recovery to occur. Internal heat continued to rise from the planet's interior. Volcanic activity never fully ceased. Carbon dioxide accumulated patiently until it could overwhelm reflection and trigger melting. Plate tectonics rearranged continents over time, altering how heat moved and where ice could persist. Life itself contributed, eventually reinforcing stabilizing cycles that softened extremes. Remove or weaken any one of these elements, and the outcome might have been very different. Earth could have remained frozen indefinitely, its oceans sealed and surface silent, a world that once hosted life but no longer allowed it to flourish. Many distant planets may lack one or more of these escape routes. Some may be smaller, losing internal heat more quickly, their volcanic engines fading early in their histories. Others may be tectonically quiet, their surfaces locked into static arrangements that favor reflection and cold. Some may orbit stars that change brightness too slowly or too unpredictably to help drive recovery. Even if life were to emerge on such worlds, it might never experience the conditions needed to expand or diversify. It could persist in hidden refuges for a time, then fade as resources dwindle. From afar, these planets would look peaceful and stable, yet their stability would be a form of confinement, not balance. This perspective reshapes how life is understood on a cosmic scale. Life is not simply a product of having the right ingredients once. It depends on sustained access to energy, motion, and cycles that renew possibility. Snowball Earth reveals that even a living planet can approach the edge of sterility without crossing it, saved only by slow, deep processes that operate far beneath immediate conditions. In the broader universe, such rescues may be uncommon. Life may arise often, but remain fragile, confined to narrow windows in time and space where climate, chemistry, and geology align just long enough for complexity to take hold. Earth's escape from its longest winters highlights how precarious habitability can be. The planet did not avoid extreme cold. It endured it, then recovered through mechanisms that required patience measured in millions of years. This endurance allowed life not only to survive, but eventually to reshape the planet itself. In doing so, Earth transformed from a world where life clung to refuges into one where life influences climate, chemistry, and surface conditions in return. This mutual relationship is rare and powerful. It stabilizes habitability, yet it emerged only after surviving near failure. When scientists search for life beyond Earth, Snowball Earth provides a sobering lens. Frozen worlds may not be empty, but they may be trapped. Warm worlds may not be stable. Life may flicker into existence and vanish again without ever leaving clear traces. Earth's long history suggests that complexity is not guaranteed by water or time alone. It requires resilience, recovery, and a planet capable of change from within. In this light, Earth appears less ordinary and more fortunate. Its history includes some of the harshest conditions imaginable, yet it retained the means to escape them. Frozen worlds beyond Earth remind us that life's presence is not simply about beginnings, but about continuation. The longest winter teaches that survival is not enough. What matters is whether a world can move again, and whether life can move with it, through darkness and back into the warmth where complexity can unfold. For all its later violence and recovery, Snowball Earth remains defined most clearly by what it lacked. Movement slowed to an almost imperceptible pace. The planet entered a span of time where change did not vanish, but retreated into the background, unfolding so slowly that millions of years could pass with little visible difference at the surface. Ice lay unbroken across continents and seas, reflecting light and sound alike, softening contrast until Earth became a world of muted signals. Weather faded, winds weakened. The rhythms that usually mark time, seasons, storms, cycles of growth and decay lost their meaning. What remained was a deep, planetary stillness, not dramatic or chaotic, but quiet in a way no other era had ever been. This was not the silence of death, but the silence of waiting, a world holding itself steady while internal processes continued beneath the surface at a pace far removed from immediate experience. In this quietest era, patience became the defining trait of the planet. Earth did not rush toward resolution. It did not force change through sudden upheaval. Instead, it allowed time itself to become the primary actor. Ice persisted not because it was reinforced daily, but because nothing challenged it strongly enough to undo it. The climate held its position through balance rather than motion, maintaining a frozen state through feedbacks that favored consistency over variation. This patience extended to every corner of the system. Oceans remained sealed, their waters layered and calm. The atmosphere stayed thin and dry, altered chemically yet outwardly unchanged. Deep below, volcanic heat and tectonic movement continued their slow work, unnoticed by the frozen surface above. Snowball Earth shows that planets do not always express change through action. Sometimes they express it through restraint, through the ability to maintain a condition for spans of time that dwarf all later histories. Life, too, learned this language of patience. During this era, survival was no longer tied to expansion, innovation, or dominance. Growth became a liability in a world without surplus energy. Instead, life shifted toward endurance, persistence, and conservation. Metabolism slowed, activity narrowed to essential processes. Many organisms likely existed near the threshold of detectability, alive without thriving, present without spreading. Survival did not mean flourishing, it meant remaining. This distinction matters deeply because it reveals a mode of life rarely considered. Life is often imagined as something that must expand or diversify to continue. Snowball Earth demonstrates that life can also persist by waiting, by holding its form steady until conditions change. Survival without growth became a valid strategy, one that preserved continuity through an era that offered almost nothing in return. This long stillness reshaped evolutionary time. Change did not stop, but it slowed to such a degree that selection favored those who could minimize change itself. Genetic stability became valuable. Energy efficiency mattered more than adaptation speed. In such conditions, Evolutionary novelty likely accumulated very slowly, held in check by the absence of opportunity. Yet this was not stagnation, it was conservation. The quietest era allowed life to carry forward ancient lineages intact, shielding them from rapid turnover and extinction that often accompany more active worlds. Snowball Earth became a kind of evolutionary pause, preserving biological possibilities rather than exhausting them. The planet mirrored this biological restraint. Landscapes were protected by ice from erosion, preserving surfaces for immense spans of time. Sediments accumulated gently beneath frozen seas. Chemical gradients changed subtly, storing potential rather than releasing it. Earth did not erase its past during this era, it archived it. The quiet preserved forms, processes, and conditions that would later be released into a world suddenly in motion again. In this way, stillness itself became productive, not by creating change, but by preventing loss. The quietest era in Earth's history stands apart from the moments before and after it. It lacks spectacle. There are no towering impacts, no erupting skies, no rapid biological revolutions. Its significance lies in duration rather than intensity. Snowball Earth teaches that survival does not always require action, and that worlds, like life, sometimes endure by learning how to wait. In the deep calm of this frozen age, Earth demonstrated an unusual strength, the ability to remain patient without collapsing, to hold itself together through time alone, carrying life forward through silence until the conditions for motion finally returned. Snowball Earth stands apart in the long memory of the planet as the most extended winter it ever endured, not because it arrived with sudden violence or left with spectacle, but because it settled in quietly and stayed. Ice advanced without urgency, season by season, latitude by latitude, until it reached places that once felt permanently warm. The freeze did not announce itself with a single moment of catastrophe. There was no day when the world suddenly changed. Instead, cold accumulated the way dust gathers in an undisturbed room, slowly enough to be missed until it filled everything. The planet adjusted to that stillness and held it, maintaining ice, silence, and restraint across spans of time that stretch far beyond human imagination. In doing so, Earth revealed a side of its nature that feels unfamiliar, not dramatic, but patient, capable of sustaining extremes, not through force, but through consistency. The longest winter was relentless precisely because it did not hurry. It waited, and in that waiting, it tested every system that depended on motion, warmth, and exchange. What endures from this story is not the image of a frozen world alone, but the way life responded to it. Life did not survive because conditions were generous or forgiving. They were not. Light was scarce. Energy was limited. Habitats narrowed. Yet life remained, not by expanding or transforming rapidly, but by holding itself together, slowing down, conserving what little was available, and enduring without expectation of improvement. Survival during Snowball Earth was not heroic in a dramatic sense. It was quiet, persistent, almost invisible. Cells divided slowly. Ecosystems reduced themselves to their simplest working forms. Lineages passed time rather than conquering space. This form of survival carries a subtle lesson that life does not always persist by pushing forward. Sometimes it persists by staying, by waiting, by refusing to disappear even when growth is no longer possible. The longest winter favored patience over power, continuity over complexity, endurance over dominance. And yet, this story does not end in stillness, it ends in return. Snowball Earth did not last forever Because the planet itself never stopped changing beneath the ice. Internal heat continued to rise. Gases accumulated, plates drifted. The slow machinery of Earth kept moving even when the surface appeared frozen in place. Balance, lost for a time, was not destroyed, it was delayed. When it finally returned, it did not do so gently, but decisively, releasing the planet back into motion and possibility. This return did not undo the hardship of the long winter, it built upon it. The recovery reshaped oceans, landscapes, and life itself, creating conditions that allowed complexity to grow in new ways. What followed the ice was not a simple restoration, but a transformation shaped by everything the planet had endured. Snowball Earth reminds us that habitability is not guaranteed by comfort, it is maintained through balance. And balance is something a planet must continually achieve rather than permanently possess. Earth's story shows that worlds can stray far from gentleness and still recover, not because the journey is easy, but because deep systems operate patiently beneath every surface condition. Life survives not because circumstances are kind, but because the broader system that contains life eventually finds a way back toward equilibrium. This does not make survival inevitable, it makes it possible. As the longest winter fades into geological memory, its meaning remains quietly present. The ice, the silence, and the waiting were not interruptions in Earth's story. They were chapters that shaped everything that followed. Snowball Earth stands as a reminder that endurance can exist without progress, that recovery can emerge from stillness, and that balance, though narrow and easily lost, has a way of returning when time is allowed to work. In the vast history of the planet, this frozen era teaches a calm truth. Life continues, not because it avoids darkness, but because it can remain through it, trusting that, sooner or later, the conditions that allow motion will come back again.